Picture this: a moonlit night in the year 1300, shadows stretching across the cobbled streets of a sleeping village. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone figure slips through the arched doorway of a monastery, clutching a forbidden manuscript. The air hums with whispered secrets, the kind that could unravel kingdoms or rewrite faith itself. This wasn't just theft, it was an act that would ripple through centuries, bending the course of history. And it's just one thread in the vast, tangled tapestry of the medieval world, where every event, every hidden decision held the weight of destiny. What if I told you that the world we know, our laws, our conflicts, even the way we think, was forged in these shadowy moments? The medieval era wasn't just a time of knights and castles. It was a crucible of mystery where power shifted in hushed conspiracies, where lost knowledge resurfaced to ignite revolutions, and where simple choices by unknown people sculpted the future in ways no one could predict. Today, we're stepping into that labyrinth. Together, we'll unravel 50 of the most crucial, spine-chilling, and utterly pivotal events that shaped medieval times, each one a doorway into a world far stranger and more consequential than fiction could ever invent. Think of this as a detective story spanning 1,000 years. We'll follow the breadcrumbs left by monks, monarchs, and rebels, clues hidden in crumbling parchments, buried beneath siege towers, or encoded in stained glass. You'll witness betrayals that toppled empires, epidemics that rewrote society, and unlikely heroes whose names history nearly erased. By the end, you won't just know these events, you'll feel them. Because these aren't dry facts from a textbook, they're the pulse beats of an era that still echoes in our lives today. So light a torch, metaphorically speaking, we're diving deep into the shadows where history's most fascinating secrets await. The year 476 might seem like just another date in history books, but the moment a Germanic warlord named Odoacer deposed Emperor Romulus Augustulus, a teenager with a grand name but no real power, was the earthquake that shattered an era. Rome, the empire that had dominated the known world for centuries, simply stopped. No grand battle, no apocalyptic siege, just a quiet abdication that echoed like a thunderclap across Europe. Imagine standing in the ruins of a colossal bridge, watching the last stone crumble into the river below. That's what this collapse felt like: a civilization's infrastructure, its laws, its roads, its very idea of order vanishing overnight. But here's the twist: Rome's fall wasn't just an ending. It was the spark that lit the Middle Ages. With no central authority, Europe fractured into a mosaic of warring kingdoms, each scrambling to fill the void. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in Gaul, the Angles and Saxons in Britain, tribes once kept in check by Roman legions, now carved up the continent like a feast. And in this chaos, something unexpected emerged: feudalism. Without Rome's bureaucracy, power localized. Knights pledged loyalty to lords, lords to kings, and kings ruled through webs of oaths and land grants. It was a system born from desperation, yet it would define medieval society for centuries. The ripple effects went deeper than politics. Trade routes crumbled, cutting off Europe from spices, silk, and even coinage. Cities emptied as people fled to the countryside, turning self-sufficient manors into the new economic units. Literacy plummeted. Why read when survival meant sowing wheat or swinging a sword? The church, once just one institution among many, became the last thread connecting a fragmented world, preserving scraps of knowledge in cloistered monasteries. Yet the most fascinating legacy of Rome's fall wasn't what was lost, it's what grew in its absence. The vacuum forced Europe to reinvent itself. No more relying on distant emperors, now survival meant adaptation. From this upheaval would rise Charlemagne's empire, the chivalric code, even the seeds of modern nations. So when you hear the Dark Ages, remember, darkness isn't emptiness. It's the fertile soil where new worlds take root. Now picture the windswept deserts of Arabia in the early 700s, where a merchant-turned-prophet named Muhammad received visions that would ignite one of history's most astonishing revolutions. In just a century after his death, Islam exploded from a local spiritual movement to an empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Himalayas, a metamorphosis so rapid it left neighboring kingdoms reeling. This wasn't just a religious awakening, it was a geopolitical tsunami that redrawn the map of the medieval world. The secret to Islam's lightning expansion lay in a potent mix of faith, military innovation, and cultural adaptability. Arab armies, fueled by a unifying belief in one God, perfected mobile desert warfare, light cavalry, and camel units that outmaneuvered the lumbering legions of Byzantium and Persia. But conquest alone didn't cement their dominance. Unlike earlier invaders who merely pillaged, Muslim rulers offered a compelling bargain: submit, pay a modest tax, and keep your land, faith, and customs. This pragmatic tolerance turned resentful subjects into willing participants in a thriving new civilization. Cities like Damascus and Baghdad became crucibles of learning where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars collaborated, translating Greek philosophy, advancing algebra, and refining medicine while Europe languished in its so-called Dark Ages. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, with its forest of arches, stood as a shimmering testament to this golden age, a place where the call to prayer echoed alongside debates about Aristotle's ethics. Yet Islam's rise also set the stage for medieval history's defining clash, the Crusades. When Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem in 1095, he wasn't just rallying knights, he was unleashing a 200-year collision of worlds. Crusader kingdoms rose and fell like sandcastles, while Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem in 1187 proved the resilience of Muslim unity. The real legacy of Islam's ascent wasn't just territorial, it was intellectual. The works of Ibn Sina and al-Khwarizmi would later fuel Europe's Renaissance, proving that ideas like empires know no borders. A faith born in the desert had woven itself into the very fabric of medieval life, leaving a tapestry still visible in our science, our architecture, and our shared history. On a frosty Christmas morning in the year 800, inside Rome's Grand St. Peter's Basilica, history took a breathless turn. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon the Frankish king's head, and with a single gesture resurrected an empire dead for over 3 centuries. The crowd erupted, chanting, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving emperor." But here's what they didn't realize: this wasn't just a coronation. It was a masterstroke of political theater that would redefine medieval Europe's destiny. Charlemagne wasn't born to imperial purple. His power grew the hard way, through 30 years of relentless campaigning, crushing Saxon rebellions and pushing his kingdom's borders deeper into pagan lands. Yet his true genius lay not in conquest but in vision. He imagined a realm where church and state intertwined like strands of a single rope, where Latin learning and Christian faith would civilize what Rome's collapse had fractured. By the time he reached Rome, he'd already rebuilt Europes Chinese letter. Now, the Pope handed him its soul. The coronation's brilliance was its ambiguity. To the Byzantines, it was heresy. Their emperors in Constantinople still claimed to be Rome's true heirs. To the Pope, it was insurance against rival Roman nobles who'd recently attacked him. For Charlemagne, sources suggest he was surprised by the act, perhaps even reluctant. But the message was unmistakable. God had chosen a new protector for Christendom, and legitimacy now flowed through the Church's hands. Charlemagne's empire became a laboratory for medieval governance. His palace at Aachen buzzed with scholars imported from across Europe, painstakingly copying ancient texts and developing Carolingian minuscule, the clear handwriting style that made manuscripts readable across dialects. Missi Dominici, his roving inspectors, enforced laws from Normandy to Bavaria, while standardized coinage revived trade. Even the humble plough saw innovations, boosting harvests to feed growing populations. Yet the Holy Roman Empire's true legacy was its paradox. It claimed universality but sowed the seeds of nationalism as local dukes and counts grew restless under imperial rule. It championed Latin unity while accelerating the fragmentation of languages into early French, German, and Italian. And when Charlemagne's grandsons split his empire at Verdun in 843, they didn't realize they were drawing the map of modern Europe. This crowning moment, part revival, part reinvention, proved empires aren't just about land or armies. They're about stories powerful enough to outlive their founders. Long after Charlemagne's bones turned to dust, the idea he embodied of a united Christian West would haunt kings, inspire crusaders, and even shape the dreams of men like Napoleon and Hitler. Not bad for a Christmas morning's work. The first longships appeared like nightmares, made real sleek, serpentine shadows slicing through dawn mist toward undefended coastal villages. When the monks of Lindisfarne glimpsed those sails in 793, they didn't just witness a raid, they saw the opening chapter of a saga that would rewrite Europe's destiny. The Vikings didn't just attack, they unraveled the map. Over the next 3 centuries, these Norse warriors would morph from plunderers to pioneers, leaving footprints from Newfoundland to Constantinople. What made Vikings unstoppable wasn't just their brutality, it was their revolutionary maritime technology. Their longships with shallow drafts and flexible oak hulls could cross oceans yet navigate rivers mere feet deep. This let them strike anywhere. Paris, Seville, even landlocked Kiev all fell victim to their hit-and-run tactics, but to label them mere raiders is to miss the bigger picture. These were also history's most ruthless entrepreneurs. While some crews sacked monasteries for silver, others established trade empires dealing in furs, amber, and enslaved people from Dublin to Baghdad's bustling markets. The real surprise was their adaptability. In Normandy, Viking leader Rollo swore fealty to France's king in 911, converting to Christianity in exchange for land, a deal that birthed the Norman dynasty, future conquerors of England. In the east, Norse traders known as Varangians became the Byzantine emperor's elite bodyguards, wielding double-headed axes in Constantinople's marble halls. And in the frozen expanses of the North Atlantic, settlers like Eric the Red turned inhospitable Greenland into a thriving colony, while his son Leif Erikson reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. Their cultural impact ran deeper than swords. Norse mythology, with its apocalyptic Ragnarök and one-eyed Odin, seeped into European folklore. Their legal assemblies, called things, planted early seeds of representative governance. Even their language endured. Every English speaker today uses Viking words like sky, egg, and law without realizing it. Yet the Vikings' greatest legacy was their role as Europe's accidental unifiers. Constant raids forced fractured kingdoms like Wessex under Alfred the Great to centralize power, forging early nations. Their trade networks connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean, circulating goods, ideas, and even diseases that reshaped societies. By the time their age waned in the 11th century, they'd ceased being outsiders. They'd become the architects of a new, interconnected medieval world. The very nations that once feared them would soon sail their own ships into history's tide, following routes the Vikings carved through storm and shadow. The air inside Constantinople's Hagia Sophia crackled with tension on July 16, 1054, as Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida marched toward the altar. In front of stunned worshippers, he slammed a parchment onto the sacred table, a papal bull excommunicating Patriarch Michael of Constantinople. With that defiant act, a rift that had been widening for centuries tore wide open. Christianity would never be the same again. The Great Schism wasn't just a theological divorce, it was the splintering of a spiritual empire that had once united Europe and Asia under a single cross. At the heart of the schism lay a tangle of disputes both profound and petty. Theological debates over the filioque clause, whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, might sound esoteric today, but for medieval clerics these words were battle lines. Language itself became a weapon. Latin clergy accused Greek theologians of arrogance, while Byzantine scholars dismissed Rome's innovations as heresy. Even something as simple as whether priests should grow beards or use leavened bread for communion fueled mutual distrust, but doctrine masked deeper fractures. Constantinople bristled at Rome's claim of papal supremacy, seeing itself as the heir of imperial Christianity, not a subordinate to some distant bishop. Meanwhile, Norman invasions of Byzantine Italy and rival missionary efforts among Slavic tribes turned spiritual competition into territorial squabbles. When Patriarch Michael ordered Latin churches in Constantinople to adopt Greek customs in 1053, it was the last straw. Humbert's excommunication, technically invalid since Pope Leo IX had already died, was less a formal decree than a theatrical gesture of final defiance. The schism's consequences rippled far beyond theology. Without Byzantine support, Rome's influence waned in the east, clearing the way for Muslim conquests of Anatolia. Crusaders sacking Constantinople in 1204 didn't see fellow Christians, they saw schismatic enemies. The divide even shaped art. Orthodox icons retained their golden, otherworldly stillness, while Catholic statues embraced emotional realism. Yet the most enduring legacy was the map of faith it drew. Today's Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic communion lines from Moscow to Mount Athos, from Poland to the Philippines, still follow the fault lines of that 11th century rupture. A single moment in a single church had split Christendom into two worlds, each convinced it held the only key to salvation. The crisp October air over Hastings in 1066 carried more than the scent of salt and damp earth. It bore the weight of history's hinge. When William of Normandy's cavalry charged up Senlac Hill that fateful October 14th, they weren't just fighting English housecarls, they were obliterating an entire epoch. King Harold's exhausted forces, fresh from defeating a Viking invasion in the north, formed a shield wall so dense that Norman chroniclers later claimed arrows bounced off like rain. But William's feigned retreats, a tactic borrowed from Byzantine manuals, lured pockets of English troops downhill where Norman horsemen cut them down. By dusk, Harold lay dead with an arrow through his eye, and England's Anglo-Saxon era bled out with him. What followed was less a coronation than a systemic overwrite. William didn't merely claim the throne, he conducted a full-scale audit of his new realm. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, wasn't just a tax register, it was the medieval equivalent of a corporate takeover, cataloguing every pig, plough, and acre so thoroughly that one scribe grumbled, there was no single hide nor yard of land left out. Overnight, Anglo-Saxon nobles found their lands parceled out to Norman barons, who built motte and bailey castles not just as fortresses, but as psychological anchors of foreign dominance. Even the landscape transformed as cleared forests made way for deer parks, a Norman passion that reshaped England's ecology. Linguistically, the conquest spliced English like a grafted tree. Anglo-Saxon peasants kept calling swine, sheep, and cows by their old names, but Norman elites dined on pork, mountain, and boeuf, birthing the class-coded duality of modern English. Latin became the language of law, French of courtly romance, and Old English of ploughs and protest. Out of this clashing lexicon emerged Middle English, a hybrid tongue that would one day birth Chaucer's verse and eventually Shakespeare's plays. Legal systems underwent a quieter revolution. William preserved effective Anglo-Saxon practices like sheriffs and hundred courts, but layered them with Norman feudalism, creating a legal patchwork that paradoxically strengthened royal authority. Trial by combat coexisted with surviving traditions of jury testimony, a messy system that slowly evolved into common law. Even the concept of legal French persisted in English courts until the 18th century, a linguistic fossil of 1066. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. The trauma of subjugation birthed a national identity forged in resistance. Robin Hood legends, those tales of an outlaw defying Norman overlords, weren't just entertainment, they were cultural therapy. Over centuries, this fusion of conqueror and conquered produced something neither purely Saxon nor Norman, but distinctly English. When Henry V triumphed at Agincourt in 1415, his army's battle cry wasn't French or Latin. It was the hybrid roar of a people who turned invasion into inheritance. The arrow that felled Harold didn't just change a kingdom, it rerouted the stream of history, and we're still wading in its currents today. The grasslands of Clermont buzzed with an electric fervor on that November day in 1095 as Pope Urban II stood before a sea of Frankish nobles and clergy. With fiery rhetoric, he painted a nightmare image: Christian pilgrims assaulted on roads to Jerusalem, holy sites defiled by Seljuk Turks, the very sepulchre of Christ under infidel control. Then came the call that would ignite 2 centuries of holy war: Deus Vult. God wills it. The crowd erupted, tearing cloth from their own garments to fashion crude crosses. What began as a desperate plea from Byzantine Emperor Alexios for mercenaries had become something far grander and more terrible: the First Crusade. This wasn't just an army marching east, it was an entire society in motion. Before the official forces departed, a ragged wave of peasants led by the charismatic preacher Peter the Hermit surged toward Constantinople, only to be slaughtered by Turkish forces at Sivtat. The true crusading host that followed in 1096 represented medieval Europe's fractured power structure: incarnate Norman warlords like Bohemond of Taranto, pious nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon, and thousands of knights and foot soldiers, all interpreting Urban's promise of spiritual rewards in their own ways. Some sought salvation, others land or loot, and many simply followed their lords into the unknown. The march itself became a crucible of suffering. Crossing the Anatolian deserts, crusaders resorted to drinking horse blood and eating thistles. At Antioch, after an 8-month siege, they discovered a relic, the holy lance that pierced Christ's side, which spurred them to victory against impossible odds. When they finally reached Jerusalem in July 1099, the starving army launched a frenzied assault. Witnesses described crusaders wading ankle-deep in blood through the Temple Mount, massacring Muslims and Jews alike in a grotesque parody of holy war. Yet the Crusades' legacy defies simple judgment. While the bloodshed stains history, the encounter between East and West sparked astonishing cultural exchanges. Crusader states like the Kingdom of Jerusalem became melting pots where Arab doctors treated Christian knights, Italian merchants traded Syrian glass for European wool, and Frankish architects blended Romanesque vaults with Islamic geometric motifs. The Knights Templar, founded to protect pilgrims, evolved into Europe's first multinational bankers, while translated Arabic texts reintroduced Aristotle and advanced mathematics to the West. What began as a collision of faiths ended as a bridge between worlds, one paved as much with shared knowledge as with shattered bones. The Crusades didn't just redraw borders, they rewired medieval consciousness, proving that even in war's darkest hours, humanity finds ways to reach across divides. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Bologna's lecture halls in the late 12th century, a quiet revolution was unfolding. Students huddled around jurists deciphering Roman law texts, while in Paris, theologians debated Aristotle's rediscovered works with an intensity that bordered on obsession. This wasn't just learning, it was the birth of the university, an institution so transformative it would become the medieval world's intellectual engine. Imagine a time when knowledge wasn't confined to monastery scriptoria but spilled into bustling urban centers, where dialectic clashes between masters and students forged new ways of thinking. The earliest universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, weren't built with grand designs but grew organically from gatherings of scholars and their pupils. In Bologna, it was the study of law that drew crowds, as Irnerius and his successors revived Justinian's legal codes, creating tools for governing nascent city-states. Paris became the epicenter of theology, where figures like Peter Abelard turned classroom debates into public spectacles. His incendiary love affair with Héloïse might be legendary, but his real legacy was sic et non, a method of reconciling contradictory authorities that laid groundwork for scholasticism. What made these institutions revolutionary was their structure. Unlike monastic schools, universities operated as self-governing guilds with charters protecting their autonomy. The term universitas originally meant a collective of masters or students bound by mutual oaths. They crafted curricula dividing knowledge into faculties: arts, medicine, law, theology, and formalized degrees that functioned as professional licenses. A master's diploma wasn't just parchment, it was a passport to teach anywhere in Christendom, creating a pan-European intellectual network. Scholasticism, the era's defining methodology, turned classrooms into battlegrounds of logic. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas sought to harmonize faith with reason, asking whether Aristotle's philosophy could coexist with Christian doctrine. The answer, his monumental Summa Theologica, became a blueprint for systematic inquiry, proving that rigorous argumentation could illuminate even divine mysteries. Yet universities weren't just ivory towers, they fueled practical advancements too. At Salerno, medical texts from Arab and Greek traditions cross-pollinated, advancing anatomy. Oxford's Robert Grosseteste pioneered experimental science, studying rainbows and proposing theories of light centuries before Newton. And when the Black Death ravaged Europe, it was university-trained doctors who dissected corpses to understand the plague, a grim but vital step toward empirical medicine. The ripple effects touched every aspect of medieval life. Legal graduates staffed royal bureaucracies, enabling centralized governance. Theology students shaped church reforms that challenged papal authority. Even vernacular literature blossomed as educated clerks like Chaucer infused their works with scholarly wit. These institutions became bridges between antiquity and modernity, proving that the medieval mind wasn't shackled by dogma, it was sharpened by it. Perhaps their most enduring gift was the idea that truth emerges through debate, not decree. In a world often fractured by violence, universities offered something radical, a space where ideas could clash without swords being drawn. The next time you walk past a college's Gothic arches, remember those stones were laid by people who believed knowledge was worth structuring civilization around. Runnymede Meadow on June 15, 1215, seemed an unlikely stage for revolution, just a waterlogged stretch of Thames riverbank where King John faced a grim assembly of barons. These were no ordinary rebels. They came armed with a document that would become the cornerstone of constitutional government. The Magna Carta wasn't born from lofty ideals but from sheer desperation. John, having lost Normandy to France, bled England dry with arbitrary taxes like the infamous scutage payments. His barons, pushed to the brink, drew up 63 clauses demanding everything from limits on feudal dues to protections against unlawful imprisonment. When John reluctantly pressed his seal into the wax, he wasn't endorsing democracy, he was saving his crown. Yet in that act, he unwittingly planted a seed that would grow far beyond medieval grudges. At its core, the Charter was a feudal repair manual, not a declaration of human rights. Clauses guaranteeing that no free man could be imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or that justice wouldn't be sold or delayed, were meant to protect aristocratic privilege, not commoners. But language has a way of outliving its authors. Within decades, legal scholars began reinterpreting phrases like liber homo, free man, to expand protections. The document's real genius lay in Clause 61, the security clause allowing barons to seize royal castles if John reneged. This wasn't just accountability, It was the radical idea that authority came with conditions. The Magna Carta's survival is a tale of historical luck. Annulled by the Pope within weeks, it was reissued under Henry III, trimmed of its most rebellious edges. Yet each reissue kept its spirit alive. By the 1300s, Parliament cited it to challenge monarchs like Edward II, while Sir Edward Coke in the 1600s wielded its text against Stuart absolutism. When American colonists cried, "No taxation without representation," they channeled Clause 12's ban on unapproved levies. The U.S. Constitution's Fifth Amendment, safeguarding due process, echoes its 13th century ancestor verbatim. Modern myths paint it as a lone beacon of liberty, but its true legacy is messier and more fascinating. It didn't end tyranny, it created a tool for fighting it. From habeas corpus to jury trials, concepts incubated in its ink became weapons in centuries-long struggles. Even its failures mattered. The clauses protecting Jewish moneylenders from excessive interest, later scrapped, show medieval law grappling with finance and prejudice in ways that still resonate. Today, 4 original copies survive, not in museums but in cathedrals and libraries, as if to remind us that rights aren't relics. They're living traditions, forged in bargains between the powerful and the desperate, still whispering across 8 centuries. The grasslands of Central Asia trembled under hoofbeats in 1227 as an army unlike any the world had seen swept westward, a tempest of mounted archers moving with terrifying coordination. When Genghis Khan's Mongols exploded onto the global stage, they weren't just conquerors. They were architects of history's most extensive land empire, stitching continents together through blood and commerce. Born as Temujin in the harsh steppes, the man who would unite the Mongol tribes rewrote the rules of warfare with innovations as lethal as they were brilliant. His cavalry didn't just charge, they feigned retreats, communicated with silk banners across vast distances, and mastered composite bows accurate at over 300 yards. But the true secret wasn't their arrows, it was their adaptability. Conquered engineers built siege engines to crush walled cities, while defectors like Chinese administrators taught them bureaucracy's power. The sheer scale of destruction still staggers the imagination. When the Khwarezmian Empire executed Mongol envoys in 1219, the retribution was apocalyptic. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara became graveyards, their irrigation systems ruined so thoroughly that some areas remain deserts today. Contemporary Persian historians wrote of pyramids built from human skulls, ghastly monuments to resistance. Yet for all their brutality, the Mongols practiced a peculiar meritocracy. A former enemy's son could rise to general if talented, and artisans were spared to serve the empire. Even religions found protection under the Great Khan's decree that all paths lead to the sky. Their greatest legacy wasn't conquest, it was connection. As Mongol Tumans secured the Silk Road from China to Crimea, commerce flourished under what historians call the Pax Mongolica. For the first time, a Venetian merchant like Marco Polo could travel from Acre to Beijing with a single safe conduct pass. Chinese gunpowder reached Europe, Persian astrolabes arrived in China, and Venetian glass appeared on Korean shores. Epidemics traveled these routes too. The Black Death likely spread via Mongol-held trading posts, rewriting Europe's demographic future. Karakoram, the Mongol capital, became a clearinghouse of global ideas. Nestorian Christians debated Buddhists while Muslim astronomers calibrated calendars for the Khan. Persian silver mingled with Chinese paper currency in history's first truly international economy. When Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, he didn't just rule China, he presided over a network linking Tokyo to Tabriz. The empire's fragmentation after the 14th century couldn't erase its impact. The Ottomans inherited Mongol military tactics. Moscow rose from a Mongol tax-collecting outpost, and Europe's age of exploration began partly in search of trade routes the Mongols had once controlled. In an era often defined by barriers, these nomadic warriors became accidental globalists, proving that even the fiercest storms can carry strange seeds of connection. The first dying sailors washed ashore at Messina in October 1347, their bodies splattered with dark pustules and their ship's decks littered with corpses. The Sicilian port's horrified residents didn't realize they were witnessing the vanguard of history's deadliest pandemic, the Black Death. Within months, the pestilence slithered along trade routes like a venomous serpent, carried by fleas on black rats stowed away in grain shipments and wool bales. By 1351, it had claimed an almost unimaginable toll, some 25 million lives across Europe, wiping out nearly half the continent's population. Entire monasteries fell silent as monks succumbed mid-prayer. Villages became ghost towns where only the wind stirred the unburied dead. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was a psychological earthquake. Medieval medicine crumbled before the onslaught. Doctors wearing beaked masks stuffed with herbs bled patients or prescribed onion poultices, unknowingly hastening deaths. Flagellants roamed the countryside, whipping their own flesh raw in desperate attempts to appease divine wrath, while pogroms erupted against Jewish communities falsely accused of poisoning wells. The very fabric of belief unraveled as people watched priests and sinners perish alike. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron captured the surreal horror, wealthy Florentines fleeing to countryside villas to tell stories while the city behind them became a charnel house. Yet from this carnage emerged unexpected transformations. With laborers decimated, surviving peasants found their bargaining power soaring. Feudal lords who once dictated terms now faced workers demanding higher wages, sparking the first widespread labor strikes. England's 1351 Statute of Labourers tried to freeze pre-plague wages, but economic gravity couldn't be denied. Serfdom's chains began loosening as desperate landowners offered land leases instead of forced service. The plague's silver lining, it accelerated the decline of feudalism, nudging Europe toward market economies. Urban centers reinvented themselves too. Venice pioneered quarantine protocols, isolating ships for 40 days, 40 giorni, while Milan's ruthless containment policies spared it the worst. Craft guilds, decimated by losses, began accepting younger apprentices and even women to fill gaps. The sudden surplus of inheritances funded new merchant ventures, laying groundwork for Renaissance capitalism. Even art transformed. Macabre dance, macabre frescoes reminded viewers of life's fragility, while the cult of saints like Sebastian and Roch, believed to ward off plague, exploded in popularity. Perhaps most profoundly, the trauma seeded intellectual rebellion. When explanations about miasmatic air or divine punishment failed, some began questioning medieval orthodoxy, planting seeds for scientific inquiry. The very institutions that had promised salvation, the church, feudal lords, royal courts, had proven powerless. In their place rose a newfound emphasis on individual agency, a quiet revolution that would eventually blossom into humanism. The Black Death didn't just kill, it cleared the ground for the modern world to take root. The vineyards of Gascony might have seemed an unlikely spark for a war that would last generations. But when French King Philip VI confiscated this prized English-held territory in 1337, he lit a fuse that would burn for 116 years. The 100 Years' War wasn't a single conflict but a series of violent spasms, a chess match played across battlefields, marriage alliances, and shifting loyalties that reshaped both nations forever. At stake wasn't just land, but the very idea of what a kingdom could be. England's early victories read like something from legend. At Crecy in 1346, French knights clad in gleaming armor charged headlong into a storm of English longbow arrows, each yeoman's weapon capable of piercing armor at 200 yards. The result, a slaughter that shattered the myth of invincible chivalry. Then came Agincourt in 1415, where Henry V's exhausted, dysentery-ridden army turned muddy terrain into a killing zone, their arrows finding gaps in plate armor like needles threading fate. For decades, it seemed England's hybrid army, disciplined archers paired with dismounted knights, was unstoppable. But wars aren't won by bows alone. Enter Joan of Arc, the illiterate peasant girl who in 1429 arrived at the Dauphin's court claiming divine voices commanded her to save France. Dressed in men's armor and radiating conviction, she broke the siege of Orleans in 9 days, a miracle that reinvigorated French morale. Her subsequent capture, trial for heresy, and execution at Rouen in 1431 only cemented her legacy as a martyr. Joan's true power wasn't military, it was symbolic. She transformed the conflict from a dynastic squabble into a sacred cause, giving France something England lacked, a nascent sense of national identity. The war's later stages revealed a changing world. Cannon fire rendered medieval castles obsolete, as demonstrated when the French recaptured Bordeaux in 1453, using siege guns that punched through walls once thought impregnable. Meanwhile, both kingdoms developed centralized tax systems to fund their armies' early steps toward modern bureaucracies. The English Parliament and French Estates General gained influence by approving war subsidies, planting seeds for representative governance. By the time the dust settled, the map of Europe had redrawn itself. England lost all continental holdings except Calais, retreating into island isolation that would later fuel its maritime empire. France, unified under Louis XI, emerged as a cohesive state with borders echoing today's. The war's greatest legacy wasn't territorial, it was ideological. It taught both peoples that kingdoms weren't just collections of fiefs bound by feudal oaths, but entities worth fighting for as nations. When Shakespeare's Henry V roused his troops with cries of "Band of Brothers," he wasn't just channeling medieval camaraderie, he was echoing a new, distinctly modern patriotism forged in the crucible of endless war. In a quiet workshop in Mainz around the year 1440, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was quietly assembling a machine that would detonate under the medieval world like an intellectual bomb. His printing press with movable metal type didn't just replicate texts, it shattered the monopoly on knowledge that had endured for centuries. Before this invention, books were painstakingly copied by hand, often by monastic scribes who might spend a year reproducing a single Bible. The cost was staggering. A handwritten Bible could equal a clerk's annual salary. Knowledge wasn't just scarce, it was shackled. Gutenberg's breakthrough lay in combining existing technologies with ruthless efficiency. Metal alloy typefaces could be rearranged endlessly, while his oil-based ink adhered crisply to vellum and paper. The real masterstroke was adapting the screw press, traditionally used for wine and olive oil, to stamp pages with mechanical precision. His 42-line Bible, completed around 1455, wasn't merely a book, it was a manifesto for mass production. Each identical copy a quiet rebellion against the era's information aristocracy. The Church initially embraced the press, seeing it as a tool to standardize liturgical texts. But the genie couldn't be forced back into the bottle. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to Wittenberg's church door in 1517, it wasn't the act itself that spread like wildfire. It was the printed pamphlets reproducing his arguments across Germany within weeks. Suddenly, theological debates weren't confined to cathedral schools. They erupted in taverns and market squares. Vernacular Bibles, once forbidden treasures, rolled off presses by the thousands, letting peasants read scripture without priestly interpretation. Scientific knowledge exploded at previously unthinkable speeds. Euclid's geometry, once locked in a handful of university libraries, became widely accessible, spurring engineering advances. Medical texts like those of Galen circulated among barber surgeons, gradually eroding medieval superstitions. Even cookbooks and agricultural manuals transformed daily life, disseminating best practices from region to region. Yet the press's most subversive gift was intangible. It taught Europe to think differently. When people could compare multiple texts side by side, authority no longer rested solely on tradition, but on evidence and argument. The very act of reading shifted from communal recitation in churches to private contemplation, a mental space where dissent could germinate. By the time church authorities tried to enforce censorship with the Index of Forbidden Books in 1559, the battle was already lost. Gutenberg died bankrupt, his invention's true impact unfolding long after his death. But his press had already set in motion forces that would fuel the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually the Enlightenment, proving that the most dangerous revolutions aren't always fought with swords, but with inked letters pressed onto paper. Dawn broke over Constantinople on May 29, 1453, to the thunder of cannons shaking the Theodosian walls, a sound that heralded the end of an era. For 53 days, Sultan Mehmed II's Ottoman forces had pounded the last shard of the Roman Empire with artillery so massive it took 60 oxen to transport a single cannon. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaeologus moved through the shadows of the Hagia Sophia, knowing his 8,000 defenders faced 80,000 Ottomans in a siege that would decide the fate of civilizations. The final assault came under cover of darkness, Ottoman troops flooding through breaches in the walls as Venetian and Genoese mercenaries fought back with Greek fire and desperation. When the Janissaries' elite slave soldiers stormed the crippled defenses near the Corinthian gate, Constantine tore off his imperial insignia and plunged into the fray, vanishing into legend. By afternoon, the crescent flag flew over the city, and Mehmed rode through streets littered with the dead, his path illuminated by flames consuming a millennium of Byzantine grandeur. He dismounted at the Hagia Sophia, where terrified citizens huddled beneath mosaics of Christ Pantocrator, and ordered the building converted into a mosque, a symbolic end to Orthodox Christianity's greatest seat of power. The fall's immediate consequences were seismic. Europe's eastern bulwark against Islam had collapsed, sending shockwaves from Rome to Moscow. Italian merchants who once dominated Black Sea trade now paid Ottoman tariffs, while Greek scholars fleeing westward carried precious manuscripts that would help ignite the Renaissance. The Sultan's triumph also reshaped warfare. Constantinople's walls, standing strong for over 1,000 years, had been felled by gunpowder, proof that medieval fortifications were obsolete. Yet the deeper legacy was psychological. For Christians, it was apocalyptic. Many believed the city's fall signaled the end times foretold in Revelation. For Muslims, it cemented the Ottomans as inheritors of both Roman and Islamic imperial glory, with Mehmed styling himself Caesar-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. The event even altered global trade routes as European powers, cut off from the east, began seeking sea passages to Asia, a quest that would lead to Columbus and Vasco da Gama. Constantinople's fall didn't just erase an empire, it forced the world to turn. The medieval Mediterranean, once a crossroads of Byzantine silk and Venetian gold, became an Ottoman lake, while the Atlantic Age dawned in its shadow. One city's death throes birthed an epoch we now call modern, proving that history's greatest ruptures often happen not with a whimper but a cannon's roar. The jagged peaks of the Pyrenees stood as silent witnesses to a conflict that would span nearly 8 centuries, a slow, grinding reconquest that reshaped the face of Iberia and the soul of Europe. It began in 711 when Muslim armies swept across the Strait of Gibraltar, toppling the Visigothic kingdom in a whirlwind campaign. Within decades, the Emirate of Al-Andalus flourished, its capitals in Cordoba and Granada becoming beacons of learning where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars worked side by side. But in the rugged north, tiny Christian kingdoms like Asturias clung to survival, their resistance igniting a struggle we now call the Reconquista, not just a war of territories but a collision of worlds. At first glance, this seemed a straightforward religious conflict, cross versus crescent, yet the reality was far messier. Christian rulers often allied with Muslim Taifa kings against rival Christian factions, while Jewish diplomats like Samuel ibn Nagrillah served as viziers in Granada's courts. The legendary El Cid, immortalized in song, fought both for and against Muslim rulers, his loyalties shifting with the political winds. Even the battlefield reflected this complexity. Toledo's conqueror Alfonso VI styled himself Emperor of Two Religions, adopting Muslim customs while promoting Christian resettlement. The turning point came in 1212 at Los Navas de Tolosa, where a coalition of Castilian, Aragonese, and Navarrese forces crushed the Almohad Caliphate's army. This wasn't just a military victory, it shattered the myth of Muslim invincibility, unleashing a cascade of Christian advances. Ferdinand III's capture of Cordoba in 1236 and Seville in 1248 sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. Yet Andalusia's conquerors often surprised their new subjects. The Great Mosque of Cordoba was preserved at first, its mihrab left intact even as a cathedral nave sprouted in its heart. Cultural exchange thrived even amid conflict. The school of translators in Toledo became medieval Europe's intellectual crossroads, where Jewish scholars rendered Arabic versions of Aristotle into Latin via Spanish. Moorish irrigation techniques transformed arid plateaus into lush huertas, while Spanish words like acequia, water channel, and algodón, cotton, seeped into everyday speech. The architectural legacy was even more visible. Mudejar craftsmen, Muslims living under Christian rule, adorned Castilian palaces with geometric stucco work and azulejo tiles, creating a style neither wholly Islamic nor European, but uniquely Iberian. Yet the Reconquista's final act proved its darkest. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west, Ferdinand and Isabella forced Granada's surrender, ending 8 centuries of Muslim rule. Their subsequent Alhambra decree gave Jews and Muslims a brutal choice: convert, flee, or die. Hundreds of thousands became refugees, Sephardic Jews scattering to Istanbul and Salonika, Moriscos converted Muslims clinging to crypto-Islamic practices until their expulsion in 1609. The Spanish Inquisition, designed to root out heresy, turned neighbor against neighbor in a paranoid hunt for secret Jews and Muslims. What began as a military campaign ended as a template for modern ethnic cleansing, but its legacy defies easy judgment. The Reconquista forged Spain's national identity while leaving wounds that still ache today. From flamenco's Moorish cadences to debates over mosque conversions, its echoes linger, reminding us that history's longest wars aren't measured in years but in the unbreakable threads of memory. The bustling docks of Lubeck in the 13th century hummed with a new kind of power, not the clatter of swords, but the clink of silver coins and the rustle of signed contracts. Here, in the heart of Northern Europe, a coalition of merchants was rewriting the rules of trade, forging an alliance so vast it would come to dominate commerce from London to Novgorod. The Hansetic League wasn't an empire with borders or armies, but a network of guilds and trading posts whose influence stretched like invisible threads across seas and forests, binding together cities in a web of mutual profit. At its peak, the League boasted nearly 200 member towns, from Bruges with its Flemish cloth to Bergen's stockfish warehouses. What began as a protective pact among German merchants banding together against pirate raids and predatory tolls evolved into a medieval precursor to a multinational corporation. Their strength lay in standardization. Hanseatic scales assured buyers of accurate weights, their shipping routes ran like clockwork, and their cargoes, timber, furs, salt, and amber, flowed along routes so reliable they became Europe's first commercial bloodstream. The League's innovations reshaped medieval economics. They pioneered trade fairs where deals were struck under the law of Lubeck, a uniform commercial code enforceable from Reval to Cologne. Their contours fortified trading enclaves like London's Steelyard and Novgorod's Peterhof operated as semi-independent city-states, where German merchants lived under their own laws, paid no local taxes, and even minted coins. When kings like England's Edward IV needed loans, it was Hansetic financiers who opened their ledgers, extracting trade privileges in return. Yet their real power was defensive. When Norway's king threatened Bergen's merchants in the 13th century, the League imposed an embargo so crippling it forced his surrender. Their ships, sleek cogs designed for Baltic storms, could transform into warships when needed, forming floating blockades. This blend of commerce and coercion reached its height in 1370, when the League's navy crushed Denmark's fleet at the Battle of Helsingborg, securing exemption from sound dues, a tax break worth fortunes in the herring trade. Cultural exchange flourished in their wake. Hanseatic routes carried not just goods but ideas. Gothic architecture spread eastward to Tallinn's skyline, while Russian furs warmed burghers in Gdansk. Their ledgers, written in Low German, became the lingua franca of northern trade, seeding dialects from Stockholm to Riga. Even Christmas traditions owe them a debt. The first documented use of a decorated tree appeared in a Hanseatic guildhall in Riga in 1510. Decline came slowly, eroded by rivals and changing times. The Dutch and English, tired of middlemen, began sailing directly to Baltic ports. The Protestant Reformation fractured the shared Catholic culture that had underpinned Hanseatic unity. MOST Chinese letter LY, the League's conservative refusal to adapt to new markets like ignoring Portuguese spices in favor of Baltic staples left them stranded in the past. By the mid-17th century, their last diet met in Lübeck, a ghost of its former self, as nation-states and joint stock companies eclipsed their model. The League's legacy, though, is indelible. It proved that economic bonds could be stronger than feudal oaths, that a well-run trade route could outlast kingdoms. Today, when container ships glide into Hamburg or Rotterdam, they're following channels first charted by Hanseatic cogs, an ancient reminder that commerce, not just conquest, can shape the world. Flames licked the thatched roofs of London in June 1381 as a mob of peasants surged through the city gates, their scythes and pitchforks glinting in the summer sun. This wasn't just a riot, it was the Peasants' Revolt, a seismic explosion of fury against a system that had squeezed England's lower classes to breaking point. At its heart marched Wat Tyler, a charismatic rebel leader whose name would echo through history, and John Ball, a radical priest whose sermons asked the question that terrified the aristocracy: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The spark came from an unpopular poll tax, the third in 4 years, demanding even starving laborers pay the same rate as wealthy merchants, but the tinder had been building for decades. The Black Death's labor shortages had given peasants fleeting leverage, only for Parliament to clamp down with the Statute of Labourers, freezing wages at pre-plague levels. Meanwhile, feudal obligations like unpaid work on lords' lands chafed against a growing sense of injustice. When tax collectors arrived in Essex and Kent that spring, villages erupted in coordinated refusal, a medieval tax strike that quickly escalated into open rebellion. Tyler's forces moved with startling discipline. They burned manorial records, the parchment chains binding serfs to the land, and executed hated officials like the Archbishop of Canterbury. Their demands, preserved in the Anonymal Chronicle, were revolutionary for their time: an end to serfdom, fair rents, and even a vague call for equal liberty. For a few dizzying days it seemed possible. The 14-year-old King Richard II, cornered at Mile End, conceded to their terms, promising charters of freedom. But the revolt's fatal flaw was its fractured leadership. While Tyler negotiated, rebels stormed the Tower of London, dragging out and beheading royal advisors in a spasm of violence that alienated moderate sympathizers. The showdown came at Smithfield on June 15th. As Tyler confronted the king's party, London's mayor struck him down in a moment of chaos. Whether by royal design or impulse remains debated. With their leader bleeding in the dirt, the peasants hesitated just long enough for royal forces to rally. Richard, shedding his conciliatory mask, snarled, "Villeins you are, and villeins you shall remain." As his knights scattered the rebels, the retribution was savage. Hanging judges rode through villages like reapers, with at least 1,500 executed. Ball was drawn and quartered, his head stuck on a pike as a warning. Yet the revolt's failure birthed unintended consequences. Though serfdom persisted, lords gradually commuted labor dues to cash rents, recognizing that whips alone couldn't control a restive population. The poll tax vanished for centuries, and English rulers grew wary of pushing taxation too far, a lesson that would resurface in the American Revolution 400 years later. Most profoundly, the revolt proved that collective action could momentarily shake feudalism's foundations, leaving cracks that would widen over time. When Wat Tyler's ghost whispered in the ears of 19th century Chartists or 20th century labor organizers, it carried a truth as old as oppression itself. Even broken revolts plant seeds. The storm erupted in the winter of 1075 when Pope Gregory VII dropped a theological bombshell, the Dictatus Papii. These 27 explosive clauses declared that only the Pope could appoint bishops, remove emperors, and even alter canon law with a stroke of his pen. But the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV wasn't about to surrender his ancient right to crown church leaders. This wasn't just a squabble over job titles, it was a medieval game of thrones where souls and scepters hung in the balance. For centuries, kings and emperors had treated bishoprics like political currency, handing out croziers to loyal nobles who'd return the favor with troops and taxes. The Church, increasingly disgusted by this simony, the buying and selling of sacred offices, saw its clergy morph into puppet administrators. Gregory, a firebrand reformer, aimed to sever this unholy alliance. His weapon, excommunication. When Henry ignored the papal decree and installed his own bishop in Milan, Gregory struck back with the medieval equivalent of nuclear sanctions. He cut the emperor off from the sacraments, effectively rendering his soul ineligible for heaven. Henry's response would become legendary. Crossing the frozen Alps in January 1077, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow outside Canossa Castle for 3 days, begging the Pope's forgiveness. Gregory, torn between Christian mercy and political strategy, finally lifted the ban, but the reconciliation was a sham. Within years, Henry rallied German bishops to declare Gregory deposed, while the Pope excommunicated him again. The spectacle revealed a brutal truth: spiritual authority and earthly power were locked in a death grip. The conflict's resolution came via compromise, but not surrender. The 1122 Concordat of Worms split the difference. Emperors could invest bishops with secular authority, but only popes granted spiritual office. This delicate dance of dual loyalty reshaped medieval governance. Bishops became hybrid figures, balancing royal service with papal fealty, while the Church gained unprecedented independence. Yet the real victor was neither pope nor emperor, but an idea that authority required legitimacy beyond mere force. When Thomas Becket defied Henry II over church rights a century later, or when Magna Carta's barons challenged King John, they were standing on ground tilled by the investiture controversy. A quarrel over who got to hire clergy had quietly planted the seed that power, even royal power, had limits. The lush hills of Languedoc in southern France hid a spiritual revolution in the early 1300s, one so threatening that the Church would bathe the region in blood to stamp it out. The Cathars, a Christian sect also known as the Albigensians, preached a faith so radical it turned medieval theology on its head. They believed in two gods, one good, one evil, rejected the material world as Satan's creation, and dismissed the Church's sacraments as hollow rituals. To them, the cross wasn't sacred but a symbol of torture, and marriage merely a trap to imprison souls in sinful flesh. This wasn't just heresy, it was an existential threat to Rome's authority. Pope Innocent III, a master tactician, first tried persuasion, sending preachers like Dominic de Guzman, later Saint Dominic, to debate the Cathars. But when a papal legate was murdered in 1208 allegedly by a Cathar sympathizer, Innocent saw his chance. Declaring a crusade not against Muslims but fellow Christians, he offered northern French knights the same spiritual rewards as those fighting in Jerusalem: absolution from sins and a ticket to paradise. The response was a flood of opportunistic nobles, led by the ruthless Simon de Montfort, eager to claim the wealthy Languedoc for themselves. The brutality that followed was methodical. Béziers fell first in 1209, its entire population massacred. Chroniclers claimed 20,000 dead, quoting the infamous order, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Carcassonne's citizens were expelled naked into the July heat. By 1244, the mountain fortress of Montségur became the Cathars' last stand. After a 10-month siege, over 200 perfecti, their spiritual elite walked willingly into the flames rather than renounce their faith. The message was clear: dissent would be exterminated. Yet the Albigensian Crusades' true impact lay beyond body counts. It birthed the medieval Inquisition, formalizing heresy hunts that would haunt Europe for centuries. Dominican friars, armed with interrogation manuals, turned suspicion into an industry, extracting confessions through psychological torment, if not outright torture. The Languedoc's vibrant troubadour culture, with its courtly love poetry and tolerance, was crushed under northern French rule. Most ironically, the Crusades strengthened the very institution it sought to protect. The papacy emerged with unprecedented power to define orthodoxy, while local lords learned challenging Rome meant annihilation. The Cathars left no scriptures, only fragments in inquisitors' trial records, but their ashes seeded something unexpected: a whisper of resistance against absolute authority, a reminder that even in faith's darkest corridors, the human spirit craves the right to ask, what if? No matter the cost, the fields near Tours shimmered with autumn mist in October 732 as two armies faced each other across the Loire River, one bearing the crescent banner of the Umayyad Caliphate, the other rallied under Charles Martel's Frankish standard. The Umayyads, having swept from Arabia across North Africa and Iberia in little more than a century, now stood at the threshold of Europe's heartland. Their cavalry, a whirlwind of armored horsemen and Berber light riders, had already razed Bordeaux and looted monasteries deep into Aquitaine. For Charles, this wasn't just another border skirmish, it was a last stand to prevent Islam's advance from becoming Europe's new reality. What unfolded that day defied expectations. The Umayyads, led by Governor Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, expected another disorganized Christian force like those they'd routed in Iberia. Instead, they found Martel's Franks dug into a shield wall atop a wooded slope, their disciplined infantry forming what one chronicler called a glacier of iron. When the Umayyad cavalry charged, the terrain neutralized their momentum, forests cramped their formations, while Frankish axes and spears hacked at exposed legs and mounts. The battle raged for days, but the turning point came when scouts reported the Umayyad camp undefended. Martel's warriors, scenting opportunity, surged forward, killing al-Ghafiqi and sending his army into retreat. The Umayyads, stripped of leadership and burdened with loot, melted back toward Iberia, never to threaten Francia again. Historians still debate Tours' strategic importance. Some argue the Umayyads were merely a raiding party, not an invasion force, their sights set on treasure, not territory. Others counter that victory here allowed Martel to consolidate power, paving the way for his grandson Charlemagne's empire. What's undeniable is the battle's psychological impact. To medieval Christians, Tours became a divine intervention, proof that God still shielded the West. The Franks, once just one barbarian tribe among many, now positioned themselves as defenders of Christendom, a mantle that would shape European identity for centuries. Ironically, the battle's real legacy may lie in what didn't happen. Without a Frankish defeat, Europe's center might have absorbed Islamic influences as Andalusia did, blending Aristotle and Quranic scholarship into its intellectual fabric. Instead, the Rhine remained a cultural fault line, with Latin Christendom developing distinctly apart from the Muslim Mediterranean. Martel, dubbed the Hammer by later chroniclers, never knew he'd fought a battle future generations would call world-changing. But history often hinges on moments unseen: a slope chosen, a commander fallen, a line that held when all seemed lost. Tours wasn't just a clash of arms, it was the moment Europe's contours hardened into the map we recognize today. Imagine a world where safety isn't guaranteed by laws or nations, but by a handshake and a sworn oath. That's the reality the feudal system carved into medieval Europe, an intricate web of loyalty, land, and military service that emerged from the wreckage of collapsed empires. As Charlemagne's grand vision splintered under Viking raids and weak successors, people turned to local strongmen for protection, forging bonds that reshaped society for centuries. At its heart, feudalism wasn't about castles or knights, it was a survival contract written in sweat and soil. The system's genius lay in its simplicity. A king granted land or fiefs to his most trusted lords in exchange for military support. These lords then parceled out smaller plots to vassals, lesser nobles who swore oaths of homage and fealty, pledging to fight for their overlord when called. At the bottom, serfs toiled the land, surrendering crops and labor in return for defense against marauders. This pyramid of obligations turned chaos into order, transforming warlords into landlords and warriors into a landed aristocracy. A single acre of fertile soil became more valuable than gold because land meant food, and food meant swords, the currency of power in an unstable world. Yet feudalism's true brilliance was its flexibility. In England, William the Conqueror used it to consolidate power after 1066, demanding oaths from all landowners at the Salisbury Plain gathering. In France, it bred a patchwork of semi-independent duchies like Normandy and Aquitaine, where dukes often rivaled the king's authority. Even Japan's samurai class and their Shun estates mirrored European feudalism, proof that disconnected cultures arrived at similar solutions when faced with weak central rule. The system's rituals were as precise as its hierarchies. The investiture ceremony, where a lord handed his vassal a clod of earth or a banner, symbolized the sacred bond between them. Breaking this bond meant dishonor, a theme woven into chivalric legends like Roland's doomed stand at Roncevaux Pass. But for all its romance, feudalism thrived on pragmatism. When a lord like Fulk Nerra of Anjou built 30 stone castles across 11th century France, he wasn't just flexing power. He was creating nodes of control in a land where loyalty was as fluid as the Loire's currents. Feudalism's decline crept in with whispers of change. The Black Death's labor shortages empowered serfs to demand wages, undermining forced labor. Gunpowder made knightly armor obsolete, while royal armies replaced feudal levies. Most crucially, the rise of trade and towns birthed a new class: burghers who owed allegiance to profit, not lords. By the time Henry VIII dissolved England's monasteries in the 1530s, seizing their lands for the crown, feudalism's bones were already dust. What endured wasn't the system, but its ghosts: the idea that privilege carries responsibility, that power flows both upward and downward. When modern politicians swear oaths of office or corporations demand loyalty from employees, they're echoing a bargain forged in the smoke of 9th century watchfires. Feudalism didn't just organize society, it taught humanity that even in chaos we crave structure, and that the strongest chains are those we choose to wear. The summer of 1212 burned with a fervor that had nothing to do with the sun. Across France and Germany, thousands of children, some as young as 6, abandoned plows and spinning wheels to join a movement that would become one of history's most haunting enigmas: the Children's Crusade. Unlike the armored knights who marched to Jerusalem, these barefoot pilgrims carried no swords, only crosses and an unshakable belief that innocence could succeed where violence had failed. The chronicles tell of two figures at its heart: a French shepherd boy named Stephen, who claimed Christ had appeared to him disguised as a beggar, and a German lad called Nicholas, whose followers believed the Rhine itself would part before them like the Red Sea. Reality, as always, was messier than legend, the traditional narrative of naive children dying en masse or being sold into slavery blurs under scrutiny. Many so-called children were likely impoverished adolescents and young adults, displaced by famines and failed harvests. Their movement wasn't a single organized march, but a series of spontaneous processions, fueled by apocalyptic preaching and desperation. In France, Stephen's followers reportedly gathered at St. Denis, expecting the sea to dry up before them. When it didn't, opportunistic merchants offered passage only to betray them in Marseille, where 7 ships allegedly sailed straight into the hands of North African slavers. The German contingent met a grimmer fate. After crossing the Alps, thousands perished from starvation and exposure, their dream of reaching Genoa and sailing to the Holy Land dissolving in Italian winter rains. The few who returned faced scorn, their ordeal twisted into a cautionary tale about disobedience. Later medieval writers, grappling with the tragedy, spun it into religious allegory, a warning against fanaticism or a testament to pure faith, depending on who held the pen. Yet the Children's Crusades' true legacy isn't in what happened, but why. This wasn't just youthful folly, it was a damning indictment of the era's failures. After 4 crusades had drained kingdoms of blood and treasure, with Jerusalem still in Muslim hands, the poor had lost faith in kings and knights. The young, raised on tales of divine intervention, saw themselves as God's answer, a generation uncorrupted by greed who could reclaim the sacred through purity alone. Their tragedy exposed the deep disillusionment festering beneath medieval Christianity's surface, where the powerless dared to imagine they could rewrite the rules of salvation. Centuries later, the story still resonates because it asks uncomfortable questions. When leaders fail, who picks up the banner? And when hope is weaponized, who bears the cost? The children who marched in 1212 left no castles or charters, just ghosts whispering that sometimes history's most powerful moments come not from strength, but from the unbearable lightness of believing. The year 1356 wasn't marked by clashing armies or royal weddings, but by a single document that would shape Central Europe for centuries, the Golden Bull. Signed by Emperor Charles IV in lavish ceremonies across Nuremberg and Metz, this decree didn't glimmer with literal gold. It earned its name from the gleaming seal that authenticated it. But make no mistake, its contents were more precious than any metal, because the Golden Bull didn't just tweak the Holy Roman Empire's rules, it rewrote the game entirely. At its core, the bull tackled a problem as old as Charlemagne's crown: how to elect an emperor without tearing the realm apart every time the throne went vacant. The solution was as elegant as it was revolutionary. 7 prince-electors, a mix of archbishops and secular lords, would form an exclusive club with the sole right to choose the next ruler. The Archbishop of Mainz, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, these weren't just fancy titles anymore, but kingmakers whose votes carried the weight of destiny. Charles, himself King of Bohemia, ensured his homeland held a permanent seat at the table, a masterstroke of self-interest disguised as reform. The bull's fine print reads like a medieval constitution, meticulously curbing the chaos of contested successions. Elections would now happen in Frankfurt, coronations in Aachen, standardizing ceremonies that had previously been ad hoc affairs. Electors gained sweeping privileges, from mining rights to the power to mint coins, making them virtually untouchable by local rivals. Most crucially, the decree abolished the old practice of dividing the empire among heirs, ensuring the title remained indivisible. No more civil wars over splintered territories, at least in theory. But the Golden Bull's true genius lay in what it didn't say. By ignoring the Pope's traditional role in confirming emperors, Charles quietly severed a thread of papal influence that had snarled imperial politics since the investiture controversy. This wasn't just bureaucratic tidying, it was a quiet declaration of independence for the German states, asserting that their ruler answered to electors, not Rome. The ripple effects transformed the empire's DNA. Electorates became dynastic powerhouses. The Hohenzollerns of Brandenburg and the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria leveraged their votes into regional dominance. Cities like Nuremberg flourished as regular election venues, while the Rhineland's archbishops became political heavyweights balancing spiritual and earthly authority. Yet the bull also cemented fragmentation. Without a strong central bureaucracy, the empire remained a patchwork of semi-sovereign states, a weakness Napoleon would exploit centuries later. What began as a pragmatic fix for medieval infighting became an accidental blueprint for federalism. When modern Germany's states retained significant autonomy under its 20th century constitution, they were walking a path paved by the Golden Bull's gilded wisdom, proof that the most enduring reforms aren't always the loudest, but those that bend power just enough to last. Dawn broke over France on Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, with a sound that would echo through history, the thunder of royal guards battering down the doors of Templar strongholds. By nightfall, thousands of knights, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, sat shackled in damp cells, accused of sins so lurid they defied belief, spitting on the cross, worshipping a demonic head called Baphomet, engaging in obscene initiation rites. This wasn't just a crackdown, it was the calculated annihilation of the wealthiest, most powerful military order Christendom had ever known, and the architect of their downfall. A cash-strapped king with a grudge and an unholy alliance with a puppet pope, Philip IV of France, nicknamed the Fair for his golden locks rather than his morals, had been eyeing the Templars' treasure for years. The order, founded 2 centuries earlier to protect pilgrims, had evolved into a medieval multinational bankers to kings, with a network of fortresses stretching from Paris to Jerusalem. Their vaults held the dowries of queens, the debts of emperors, and possibly even fragments of the true cross. But Philip wasn't just after gold. The Templars' independence gnawed at him. They answered only to the Pope, making them a state within a state. When his earlier scheme to join their ranks and cancel his crushing debts was rebuffed, revenge became inevitable. The trials that followed were a masterclass in medieval showmanship. Under torture, knights confessed to everything demanded of them. One described kissing his initiator on the base of the spine, while others spoke of a mysterious idol with glowing eyes. These confessions, extracted with racks and burning irons, were then paraded before the public like macabre theater. Pope Clement V, installed in Avignon under Philip's thumb, reluctantly disbanded the order in 1312, though he privately doubted the charges. Yet the Templars' end only deepened their mystique. As Jacques de Molay burned at the stake in 1314, legend claims he cursed Philip and Clement, summoning them to God's judgment within a year, a prophecy seemingly fulfilled when both died shortly after. Their treasure never found, rumors swirled of galleys slipping away from La Rochelle under cover of darkness, bound for Scotland or the New World. Some say their relics, perhaps the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail, still lie hidden beneath Rosslyn Chapel's carved arches. Modern historians see a simpler truth. The Templars were victims of their own success. Their financial acumen made them indispensable until it made them targets. Their real legacy isn't in lost gold or occult rituals, but in the blueprint they left for everything from Swiss banking to special forces units. Even the superstition surrounding Friday the 13th traces back to that fateful October morning, proof that sometimes history's greatest power lies not in what was destroyed, but in the stories that refused to die. The skies over Europe darkened in the spring of 1315, not with storm clouds, but with an unending deluge that would drown hope for 3 harrowing years. Fields became swamps, grain sprouted mold before reaching maturity, and livestock drowned in waterlogged pastures. This wasn't just bad weather, it was the opening act of the Great Famine, a catastrophe so severe that chroniclers described parents abandoning children and peasants gnawing on tree bark to survive. Behind this misery lay a climatic anomaly modern scientists call the Little Ice Age, a shift in global weather patterns that turned Europe into a soggy, sun-starved wasteland. What began as agricultural failure spiraled into societal collapse. With grain prices skyrocketing eightfold in some regions, thieves risked execution to steal loaves of bread. Monasteries recorded desperate crowds at their gates, while royal treasuries hemorrhaged silver importing food from the Mediterranean. In England, Edward II struggled to feed his court, let alone his subjects. But the famine's cruelty wasn't just hunger, it weakened bodies for disease. Contemporary accounts describe swollen limbs, skin lesions, and outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire, a gangrenous condition caused by ergot-infected rye. Starving refugees carried these afflictions along muddy roads, turning villages into tinderboxes of pestilence. The famine exposed feudalism's fragile underpinnings. Manorial records show crop yields plummeting by as much as 80%, a death blow to an economy built on grain dues. Serfs who couldn't pay rents were evicted, while knights found their feudal levies useless against an enemy that couldn't be slain with swords. In Flanders, textile workers revolted when wool imports dried up. In Germany, pogroms targeted Jewish communities accused of hoarding food. Even the church's authority wavered as prayers failed to bring relief. Some processions degenerated into riots when promised alms didn't materialize. Yet the Great Famine's most ominous legacy was the stage it set for the Black Death. Malnourished populations had no reserves to fight off the plague's bacterial onslaught 3 decades later. Abandoned fields became breeding grounds for disease-carrying rodents, while weakened immune systems turned minor infections into death sentences. When the plague finally arrived, it found a continent still staggering from famine's blow. A reminder that nature's wrath often comes not as a single disaster, but as a cascade of calamities. Archaeology tells the silent side of this story. Mass graves from the famine years reveal stunted bones and enamel defects, permanent scars of childhood deprivation. In coastal regions, sediment layers show how flooding permanently altered farmland, pushing survivors into overcrowded towns where diseases festered. The famine didn't just kill, it reshaped demographics with birth rates crashing and marriages declining, a missing generation whose absence would echo for decades. What makes this crisis so haunting isn't just the suffering, it's the eerie parallels to our own climate-vulnerable world. When 21st century farmers struggle with unpredictable growing seasons, they're facing the same existential gamble medieval peasants lost. The Great Famine whispers a warning across 7 centuries. Civilizations thrive or crumble at the mercy of harvests, and no castle walls can hold back the storms of a changing planet. The mud-clogged fields of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, bore witness to a slaughter that defied all odds. King Henry V's army, a ragged band of 6,000 English and Welsh archers, men-at-arms and knights, stood shivering in the autumn rain, outnumbered nearly 5-1 by France's flower of chivalry. The French cavalry, clad in gleaming plate armor worth a peasant's lifetime wages, had every reason to expect an easy victory. What followed wasn't just a battle. It was the brutal unraveling of medieval warfare's sacred rules, where peasant-born longbowmen humbled nobility with arrows that rained like Judgment Day. Henry's secret weapon wasn't technological. The longbow had existed for centuries, but tactical. His archers, each wielding a 6-foot yew stave with a draw weight of 150 pounds, could loose 15 arrows a minute to pierce armor at 200 yards. But raw power meant nothing without terrain. Henry chose his killing ground with cold precision, a freshly plowed field narrowed by dense woods, forcing the French into a bottleneck where their numbers became a liability. As mounted knights charged through the muck, their horses floundered in ground churned to quicks, and by overnight rains, the longbowmen's stakes planted at angles before the battle impaled charging destriers like skewers. turning the cavalry advance into a writhing barricade of flesh and steel. What truly broke the French, though, was their own arrogance. Ignoring lessons from Crécy and Poitiers, they dismounted most knights, sending them lumbering forward in armor so heavy that fallen warriors drowned face down in puddles. English arrows didn't just kill, they terrorized. A single volley of 50,000 arrows blackened the sky, each bodkin-tipped shaft capable of punching through visor slits or pinning gauntleted hands to shields. When the melee finally closed, exhausted Frenchmen found themselves swarmed by lightly armored Englishmen wielding mauls and axes, bludgeoning them in the mud like fish in a barrel. By day's end, nearly 6,000 French nobles lay dead, including the Duke of Brabant and Constable of France, while Henry lost perhaps 400, a casualty ratio that still stuns military historians. Agincourt's legacy transcended tactics. For England, it became the cornerstone of national myth, proof that disciplined yeomen could outfight continental aristocracy. Shakespeare immortalized Henry's St. Crispin's Day speech, whispering to every underdog that we few, we happy few, could defy impossible odds. The longbow entered legend as the great equalizer, though its dominance was already waning against gunpowder's rise. More subtly, the battle exposed feudalism's decay when commoners could slaughter nobles by the thousand. The old hierarchies began crumbling like rusted armor. Yet the victory's glow faded fast. Henry's subsequent campaigns failed to secure lasting gains, and within 30 years, England lost all French holdings except Calais. What endured wasn't territory, but an idea that identity could be forged in the crucible of shared struggle. 6 centuries later, when English football fans chant Agincourt at French rivals, they're not recalling tactics or treaties, but that fleeting moment when mud, blood, and new bows wrote a nation's destiny in the soil of a foreign field. The plains of Clermont in November 1095 crackled with an energy that hadn't been seen in generations, a restless mix of piety, desperation, and pent-up violence. Pope Urban II, clad in white vestments under the autumn sky, didn't just deliver a sermon that day, he lit a fuse that would ignite the medieval world. His audience wasn't just a gathering of bishops and nobles, it was a tinderbox of warriors hungry for redemption, landless younger sons, and peasants who'd spent lifetimes eking out survival on depleted soil. Urban's words, meticulously crafted and explosively delivered, didn't merely ask for aid to Byzantium, they offered something far more intoxicating, a chance to trade earthly suffering for celestial glory. His speech, reconstructed from chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres, was a masterclass in medieval persuasion. Urban painted the East in lurid strokes: Christian pilgrims allegedly tortured on roads to Jerusalem, churches desecrated, the Holy Sepulchre defiled. But the true genius lay in how he intertwined spiritual and practical rewards. Let those who have been accustomed to wage private war wastefully even against believers, he thundered, now march against the infidels. For knights drowning in debt from endless feuds, this was divine permission to redirect their violence outward. For peasants, he dangled the ultimate prize, remission of sins for all who die in the service of Christ. Suddenly, the grim calculus of medieval life shifted wide till barren fields when martyrdom offered instant salvation. Urban's tactical brilliance extended beyond theology. He leveraged feudal obligations, appealing directly to lords to lead their vassals eastward. He stoked tribal rivalries by promising the Franks they'd outshine other Christian nations in God's eyes. Most audaciously, he invoked the concept of pilgrimage, a familiar, sacred journey, but fused it with armed conquest. This wasn't just spiritual duty, it was holy warfare with a passport to paradise. When the crowd erupted with cries of Deus Vult, God wills it, it wasn't spontaneous fervor. It was the culmination of a speech that had turned personal desperation into collective destiny. The aftermath revealed the power of well-targeted rhetoric. Attendees tore up their own cloaks to fashion makeshift crosses, creating the movement's iconic symbol. But Urban's words also unleashed forces he couldn't control. The disorganized People's Crusade, a ragtag horde of peasants and minor nobles, would march east months before the official armies, sparking pogroms against Rhineland Jews and meeting slaughter in Anatolia. Yet even these chaotic expeditions proved Urban's central thesis. Medieval Europe was primed for explosion. The First Crusade's eventual capture of Jerusalem in 1099, against all odds, cemented his speech as one of history's most consequential moments, proof that words, when they tap into the deepest fears and longings of an era, can move millions to action. Urban didn't live to see the full consequences of his call. He died in 1099, just 2 weeks after Jerusalem fell, a cosmic irony for a man who'd promised heavenly rewards for those who died en route. His legacy wasn't just the blood-soaked battlefields or the short-lived Crusader kingdoms, but the dangerous idea he implanted in the medieval mind, that violence could be sanctified, that geography held spiritual power, and that faith could be wielded as both shield and sword. Centuries later, when conquistadors invoked God while plundering the Americas, or when colonial powers framed expansion as divine mission, they were echoing the tectonic shift that began on those wind-swept plains of Clermont. The walls of Jerusalem shimmered under the merciless July sun in 1099, but the air smelled not of olive groves or desert wind. It reeked of blood, smoke, and desperation. For 5 weeks, the Crusader army had besieged the Holy City, their numbers whittled down by thirst, disease, and relentless skirmishes. Now, as makeshift siege towers lurched toward the battlements on the morning of July 15th, something electric pulsed through the ranks. These weren't just soldiers, they were starving pilgrims who'd marched 2,000 miles through Anatolian wastes and Syrian deserts, fueled by visions of salvation. When the first ladder touched stone, the final assault became a frenzy of divine vengeance and naked survival. Fatimid defenders rained Greek fire and arrows on the attackers, but the Crusaders' desperation outpaced their fear. At the critical moment, a knight named Godfrey of Bouillin's men breached the northern wall near Herod's Gate, while Raymond of Toulouse's forces stormed the southern Zion Gate. What followed wasn't conquest, it was carnage so extreme even Crusader chroniclers struggled to sanitize it. Tancred's men slaughtered refugees sheltering in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, mistaking their promised gold for gilded dome reflections. Streets ran red as Frankish swords spared neither woman nor child. Contemporary accounts claim horses, waded ankle-deep in blood from the Temple Mount to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Jewish families burned alive in their synagogues when attackers barred the doors. The scale of atrocities shocked even medieval sensibilities. A witness wrote that the massacre made the Crusaders seem like gods drunk on blood. Yet amid the horror, eerie rituals unfolded. Barefoot and weeping, survivors processed to Christ's tomb, their grime-caked hands tracing the stone where his body once lay. To them, this wasn't butchery, it was purification. Their justification, Urban II's promise that liberating Jerusalem would cleanse all sins. The irony was bitter. A quest framed as defense of Christianity had birthed scenes mirroring the very barbarism they condemned in Infidels. The aftermath reshaped the Levant's political map overnight. Godfrey, refusing a golden crown where Christ wore thorns, took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. His realm, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, became the crown jewel of 4 Crusader states, including Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli. These weren't colonies but fragile experiments in hybrid rule. Frankish knights adapted Arabic irrigation techniques, minted coins with Arabic inscriptions, and even employed Muslim troops. The Assizes of Jerusalem, a groundbreaking legal code, allowed subjects to be judged by their own religious laws, a precocious nod to pluralism. But the siege's darkest legacy was the precedent it set. For Muslims and Jews, 1099 became a trauma echoing through centuries, a reference point for Salah ad-Din's chivalric reconquest in 1187 and modern conflicts alike. For Europe, it birthed the toxic myth that holy ends justify savage means. When later Crusades devolved into campaigns against Christian Constantinople or Rhineland Jews, they were following a path paved in Jerusalem stones that to this day, whisper of the day faith turned fanatical and heaven itself seemed to grimace. The forests of northern France in the mid-12th century were alive not with the sounds of wildlife, but with the ceaseless chiseling of stone and the rhythmic pounding of mallets, a symphony of human ambition echoing through the scaffolding of what would become the world's first Gothic cathedrals. In the small town of Saint Denis, just outside Paris, Abbot Suger stood in the half-built choir of his basilica in 1140, gazing up at something revolutionary, slender columns supporting a vaulted ceiling that seemed to float on light itself. This wasn't just a new style of building, it was a theological manifesto carved in stone and glass, a defiant rejection of the dark, fortress-like Romanesque churches that had dominated Europe for centuries. The secret to Gothic architecture's soaring heights lay in its skeletal structure, an engineering marvel that redistributed weight like a carefully balanced spiderweb. The pointed arch, borrowed from Islamic builders via Crusader encounters, channeled gravitational forces downward more efficiently than rounded Romanesque arches. Ribbed vaults allowed ceilings to climb higher without collapsing under their own mass, while flying buttresses, those graceful stone fingers gripping the walls from outside, absorbed lateral thrust, freeing interior space from bulky supports. The result, walls that could dissolve into vast mosaics of stained glass, transforming sunlight into divine radiance. Chartres Cathedral's famous Blue Virgin window wasn't just decoration. It was theology in color, bathing worshippers in celestial hues as if heaven itself had kissed the glass. Every element carried layered meaning. The cathedral's floor plan, shaped like a cross, invited pilgrims to literally walk the path of Christ. Gargoyles weren't mere grotesques, they were visual sermons, reminding the faithful that evil lurked even at the gates of holiness. The rose window above Notre Dame's west portal, with its intricate geometric patterns, echoed medieval cosmology, the harmony of mathematical perfection reflecting God's ordered universe. Even the seemingly secular craftsmanship hid spiritual intent. Guilds competed to carve ever more exquisite capitals, believing their work glorified God through earthly skill. The social impact was as profound as the aesthetic. Building a cathedral became a communal act of devotion spanning generations. Chartres took 66 years, Cologne over 600. Towns bankrupted themselves for the honor, knowing these stone Bibles would outlast kingdoms. Pilgrims flocked to sites like Canterbury, their footsteps funding local economies. The stonemasons' lodge evolved into a proto-union, protecting trade secrets passed down through master-apprentice chains. Gothic cathedrals became Europe's first true public spaces, where beggars and kings alike marveled under the same vaults, united in awe. Yet Gothic's true triumph was how it mirrored the medieval mind's evolution. The shift from thick walls to delicate traceries paralleled Scholasticism's quest to reconcile faith with reason. Just as Thomas Aquinas sought to systematize theology, architects were organizing space with mathematical precision. When Abbot Suger wrote that these luminous spaces lifted souls from material to immaterial things, he captured Gothic's essence, a bridge between earth and heaven, built not with brute force, but with light, logic, and transcendent ambition. To stand beneath Rheims Cathedral's 125-foot nave isn't just to witness engineering, it's to experience the moment the Middle Ages reached for the sky and touched the divine. In the sun-drenched hills of Languedoc, a quiet spiritual revolution took root in the 12th century, one so radical it threatened to unravel the very fabric of medieval Christianity. The Cathars, known also as the Albigensians after their stronghold in Albi, preached a faith that turned church doctrine inside out. For them, the material world wasn't God's creation but the prison of a malevolent demiurge, the body a corrupt vessel trapping divine sparks of light. Marriage, they declared, was sinful, a chain binding souls to flesh, while their priests, the perfecti, lived in strict poverty, refusing all animal products and vowing celibacy. Most shocking of all, they dismissed the crucifixion as meaningless, for how could a benevolent God take human form in such a wretched world? The Church's response began with persuasion. Saint Dominic himself walked barefoot through Languedoc's vineyards, debating Cathar elders in public squares. But when his intellectual appeals failed and a papal legate was murdered in 1208 allegedly by a Cathar sympathizer, Rome's patience snapped. Pope Innocent III, a canon lawyer with a taste for decisive action, unleashed something Christendom had never seen: a crusade not against Muslims but against fellow Christians. His call to arms promised the same spiritual rewards as fighting in Jerusalem: remission of sins, eternal glory, and the nobles of northern France, eyeing Languedoc's wealthy cities, needed no further incentive. The Albigensian Crusade became a masterclass in medieval brutality. At Béziers in 1209, when soldiers asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics, the papal legate reportedly declared, "Kill them all, God will know his own." 20,000 perished as the city burned, its cathedral turned into a slaughterhouse. Carcassonne fell next, its residents expelled naked into the summer heat. Simon de Montfort, the Crusades' ruthless leader, carved out a personal fiefdom from the carnage, only to meet his end when a stone from a mangonel allegedly operated by women defending Toulouse crushed his skull. Yet the Cathars' true nemesis wasn't the sword, but the systematic machinery of the Inquisition. Dominican friars, armed with interrogation manuals, methodically dismantled the movement. Suspects were questioned for inconsistencies, their neighbors bribed or threatened into testifying. Those who confessed faced penitential crosses sewn onto their clothes. Those who refused vanished into dungeons or the stake. By 1244, the last Cathar stronghold at Montségur became their Masada. After a 10-month siege, over 200 perfecti marched into a giant pyre rather than renounce their faith, some leaping into the flames singing. The Crusades' collateral damage reshaped Europe's cultural landscape. Languedoc's troubadour tradition, with its poetry of courtly love and religious tolerance, was snuffed out. The independent counts of Toulouse lost their power, absorbed into the French crown. Most consequentially, the Inquisition emerged as a permanent shadow, a bureaucracy of suspicion that would haunt Europe for centuries. But the Cathars' ghost lingered. Their rejection of materialism and hierarchy echoed in later reformers like the Waldensians. The legend of their lost treasure, rumored to be the Holy Grail itself, inspired medieval romances and modern conspiracy theories alike. Today, tourists walking Carcassonne's ramparts or Montségur's windswept ruins aren't just seeing medieval history. They're touching the scar tissue of a world where heresy wasn't just disagreement, but a threat so dangerous it justified turning faith into a weapon. The ink was barely dry on William the Conqueror's coronation parchment when the real work of reshaping England began. An administrative overhaul so thorough it would make modern bureaucrats blush. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, wasn't just a tax survey. It was the medieval equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover audit. Royal commissioners fanned out across every shire, grilling local jurors under oath about who owned what before the conquest, who held it now, and crucially, how much it was worth. Sheep, plows, even fish weirs were tallied with ruthless precision. One scribe marveled that not one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig was left out. For the Anglo-Saxon peasant tilling his strip of land, this meant his every turnip and chicken now existed in a ledger that determined his worth to foreign overlords. But the conqueror's true genius lay in how he weaponized this data. The Domesday Book allowed him to squeeze England like a sponge, extracting over £6,000 in annual revenue, nearly double what the Saxon kings collected. Yet this wasn't mere greed, it was systemic reinvention. William replaced the old Anglo-Saxon earls with Norman barons, but cleverly scattered their estates across counties to prevent regional power bases. A lord might hold land in Devon, Yorkshire, and Kent, ensuring rebellion in one area wouldn't give him a geographic stronghold. These barons owed quotas of knights to the crown, creating a pyramid of military obligation that turned England into Europe's most centralized feudal state. The Cultural Revolution ran deeper than governance. Within a generation, the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy vanished, replaced by French-speaking Normans who built motte and bailey castles not just as fortresses, but as psychological symbols of dominance. Place names hybridized: Saxon, tun, town, fused with Norman suffixes like ville, creating hybrids like Preston or Wigston. Even the landscape transformed as Norman lords raised villages for deer parks, a continental hunting obsession that permanently altered England's ecology. Language became a battlefield of its own. Latin dominated court records, French the aristocracy's dinner tables, while Old English survived among peasants naming everyday things. A cow in the field remained coo to the ploughman, but on the noble's plate it became boaf. This linguistic apartheid birthed Middle English, a melting pot that would later give us Chaucer's tales and Shakespeare's sonnets. Most enduring of all was the legal legacy. William preserved effective Saxon systems like shire courts and sheriffs, but layered them with Norman feudalism. The result, a messy but adaptable common law tradition where trial by jury coexisted with royal justices riding circuit, a system so robust it would outlive empires. When Henry Roman II later expanded these courts, or Magna Carta, limited royal power, they were building on foundations laid in Hastings' bloody aftermath. The conquest didn't just change who ruled England, it forged a new nation from the collision of two worlds, one where even today the ghost of Norman efficiency lingers in every property deed and courtroom oath. The plague's shadow didn't just darken graveyards, it seeped into the very soul of medieval culture, twisting art, faith, and storytelling into strange new shapes. Walk into any 14th century church after the Black Death, and you'd confront a haunting spectacle: frescoes of grinning skeletons waltzing with kings, popes, and peasants alike, the danse macabre. This wasn't mere decoration, it was a psychological coping mechanism painted on chapel walls. For a society that had watched half its population vanish in months, these dancing corpses delivered a grimly comforting message: death was the ultimate equalizer. Whether you wore a crown or rags, the reaper's bony fingers would eventually tap your shoulder. Literature, too, choked on the ashes of certainty. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written as Florence's streets filled with corpses, became the medieval equivalent of gallows humor. Noble youths fleeing the plague told ribald tales of lust and deception, not to mock suffering, but to affirm life's tenacity. Meanwhile, Piers Plowman's allegorical farmer plodded through a world where priests abandoned their flocks and laborers starved, a stark indictment of a social order that had failed its people. Even children's rhymes bore scars: ring around the roses, ashes, ashes, likely referenced plague-fueled cremations. Religious practice underwent its own fevered transformation. Flagellant cults, their backs striped with self-inflicted wounds, marched from town to town, believing pain could purge sin and halt the pestilence. Pilgrimages surged to shrines of plague saints like Roch and Sebastian, their martyred bodies supposedly offering divine immunity. Yet beneath the fervor lurked doubt. Why had monasteries, those supposed bastions of piety, been ravaged just as cruelly as taverns? The Church's answer, a doubling down on indulgences and relics, only deepened fractures that would later erupt in the Reformation. But the most unexpected shift was in everyday aesthetics. Before the plague, art had been gold-leafed and serene, its saints floating in eternal bliss. Now patrons demanded realism: the agonized faces of Christ, the festering wounds of martyrs. Even fashion turned macabre. Memento mori jewelry featured skulls and hourglasses, while the wealthy wore pointed poulain shoes so exaggerated they had to be chained to the knees, a grotesque satire of vanity in a world where life could snap like a thread. Through it all ran a single, unspoken revelation. The medieval mind had glimpsed its own fragility. When the next plague wave hit, they didn't just pray, they partied. Feast day processions grew wilder, carnival masks leered more boldly, and poets wrote odes to fleeting pleasure. The Black Death hadn't just killed people, it had murdered blind faith in tomorrow. In its place rose something startlingly modern, the understanding that beauty and terror were twined like vines, and that art's highest purpose might be to stare into the abyss and dance. Blood-soaked conquest gave way to an unlikely golden age as the Mongols, those same warriors who had built pyramids of skulls, suddenly became history's most ruthless peacekeepers. The Pax Mongolica wasn't just a pause between wars. It was a superhighway of ideas, goods, and cultures stretching from the Danube to the Pacific, all held together by the iron discipline of Genghis Khan's successors. Picture Venetian merchants like Marco Polo traveling from Acre to Beijing with nothing but a paser, a Mongol safe conduct tablet, as their passport, knowing bandits who dared touch them would face extermination. This was globalization's first draft, written in hoofprints and stamped with the Great Khan's seal. What made this possible was the Mongols' unique approach to empire. Unlike previous conquerors who imposed their culture, they acted as facilitators, so long as tribute flowed and rebellion stayed at bay. They standardized weights, introduced paper currency backed by silk reserves, and even established a Pony Express-style relay system called the Yam, where riders could cover 200 miles in a day swapping exhausted horses at way stations. A Persian chronicler marveled that a lone woman could walk from the Black Sea to China with a golden tray on her head without fear. Hyperbole, perhaps, but one rooted in the era's startling stability. Trade routes became intellectual conduits. Persian astronomers shared celestial charts with Chinese scholars in Karakoram's observatories, while Tibetan doctors blended Arab pharmacology with traditional remedies. The Mongols' religious tolerance stemming from their shamanistic belief that all faiths were paths to the sky created surreal scenes. Nestorian Christian churches stood beside Buddhist temples in Mongol-controlled Baghdad, while Muslim architects designed pagodas for Kublai Khan's summer palace. Even food transcended borders. Pasta from Italy met Central Asian dumplings in Mongol camps, birthing culinary hybrids like the pierogi. Yet the Pax Mongolica's darkest export was invisible: the Black Death. Those very trade routes that carried silks and spices also hosted fleas on plague-infested rodents, unwittingly setting the stage for the 14th century's catastrophe. The Mongols' biological legacy proved as world-changing as their political one. When the empire fragmented into rival khanates, the Yuan in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, they took the system's blueprints with them. The Ottomans inherited Mongol cavalry tactics. Moscow rose from a Mongol tax collection outpost, and European explorers like Columbus sailed west partly because the Pax Mongolica had first shown what lay east. The Mongols didn't just conquer the world, they connected it, leaving a paradox as vast as their steppes. Sometimes the fiercest peace comes on the heels of the storm. The cold stone walls of Rouen Castle in the winter of 1431 held a prisoner who would transform from a heretic to a saint, a teenage girl whose very existence threatened empires. Joan of Arc, captured by Burgundian forces and sold to the English for 10,000 livres, now faced not just political enemies, but an elaborate heresy trial designed to break her spirit and erase her legacy. The tribunal, stacked with pro-English clergy, spent months picking apart her visions of Saint Michael and Saint Catherine, twisting her insistence on wearing men's armor into charges of blasphemy and cross-dressing. Yet through 70 interrogations, Joan's responses cut through their theological traps with astonishing clarity. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a trick question implying certainty was heresy, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may He keep me there." Even her accusers admitted her composure shook them. Her execution on May 30, 1431, was meant to be more than just a death. it was psychological warfare. Burned at the stake in Rowan's marketplace, her ashes were scattered in the Seine to prevent relics, but the flames that consumed her body only forged her legend. Within days, rumors spread that her heart had refused to burn, and that English soldiers reported seeing Jehan spelled in the smoke. The very judge who condemned her, Pierre Corchon, died suddenly months later, a twist chroniclers called divine retribution. What the English hadn't anticipated was how Joan's martyrdom would crystallize French identity. Her prophecies, like predicting her wound at Orleans and the crowning at Reims, were retold as proof of divine favor. Poets recast her as La Pucelle, the pure maiden who embodied France itself, violated by foreign invaders. By the time Charles VII reclaimed Rowan in 1450, his first act was ordering an inquiry that overturned her conviction, not just for justice, but because rehabilitating Joan meant legitimizing his own divinely sanctioned rule. Centuries later, her canonization in 1920 wasn't merely religious, it was political theater. A France shattered by World War I needed a unifying myth, and Joan, the peasant girl who saved a broken nation, became the perfect symbol. Today, her image splinters across ideologies. Far-right movements hail her as a nationalist icon. Feminists celebrate her defiance of gender norms, and the Church reveres her as proof that saints can emerge from the unlikeliest places. In Rowan, where she was killed, a modern church shaped like an overturned boat stands near the execution site, a silent reminder that the girl who heard voices in a garden became the conscience of a nation, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a sword but an unshakable belief. The Gutenberg Bible wasn't just a book, it was a revolution bound in vellum, each of its 42 lines of Latin script whispering a challenge to the medieval world's information monopoly. Printed around 1455 in Mainz, fewer than 200 copies were made, yet their impact dwarfed the output of scriptoria that had painstakingly produced manuscripts for centuries. What made these volumes extraordinary wasn't just their mechanical perfection, the crisp black-letter type mirroring scribble handwriting, but their cultural audacity. For the first time, sacred text existed outside monastery walls, its uniformity suggesting divine word could be replicated without priestly mediation. Wealthy patrons like the Archbishop of Mainz clamored for copies, not realizing they were financing the demise of their own gatekeeping role. Beyond scripture, early presses fed a hunger for knowledge that had been simmering beneath feudalism's surface. Latin grammars and classical text Cicero, Virgil rolled off presses in Basel and Venice, giving rise to a new intellectual class who could afford books previously worth a year's wages. But the true surprise was the demand for vernacular works. Printers quickly realized that mass appeal meant catering to local tongues. German plenaria with gospel translations, French books of hours for pious bourgeois housewives, even raucous chanson digest epics that turned Charlemagne legends into medieval bestsellers. A single press in Strasbourg produced over 30 editions of Till Eulenspiegel, a trickster tale mocking clergy and nobles alike, proving satire traveled faster in print than by minstrel song. The ripple effects reached unexpected corners of daily life. Herbal guides like Hortus Sanatotis democratized medical knowledge, while Ars Moriendi pamphlets comforted the dying with standardized deathbed rituals. Cookbooks preserved regional recipes, merchant manuals standardized accounting practices across Europe's growing trade networks. Even playing cards printed in Bavarian workshops carried suits reflecting medieval social hierarchy, kings, knights, and peasants immortalized in inked cardboard. Most transformative of all was print's role in shaping collective identity. Before Gutenberg, regional dialects drifted like unmoored boats. Now, Luther's Bible translations codified modern German, while Caxton's English Canterbury Tales editions smoothed London's dialect into a national standard. What began as a technical marvel became history's first algorithm encoding not just words, but the very frameworks through which people understood their world. When a Venetian printer bound Euclid's Geometry alongside Dante's Commedia in 1481, he unwittingly proved that revolutions aren't always fought with swords. Sometimes they're pressed onto paper, one inked letter at a time. Constantinople's shattered gates in 1453 didn't just mark an empire's collapse, they became the unwitting launchpad for Europe's intellectual rebirth. As Ottoman troops swept through the city's labyrinthine streets, a quiet exodus was already underway. Scholars clutching parchment scrolls, artists bundling their pigments, and philosophers stuffing saddlebags with manuscripts older than the Crusades. These refugees didn't carry weapons or treasure, their cargo was far more dangerous. Packed among their belongings were the unedited works of Plato, Euclid's geometric treatises, and astronomical texts from Ptolemy, knowledge that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries while Western Europe cobbled together fragments from Arabic translations. The most sought-after prize, the complete dialogues of Plato, virtually unknown in the West except through second-hand summaries. When the Neoplatonist philosopher George Gemistos Plethon arrived in Florence for the 1438 Council of Union, his lectures on Plato's laws electrified Cosimo de' Medici, so much so that the banking magnate bankrolled Marsilio Ficino's translations, igniting a philosophical wildfire. Suddenly, Europe's intellectuals realized how much had been lost. Entire dimensions of Greek thought that made the Latin Scholasticism they'd been studying seem like faded photocopies of a masterpiece. Venice became a hothouse for this cross-pollination. Cardinal Bessarion, a Byzantine immigré, bequeathed his library of nearly 1,000 Greek codices to the city in 1468, demanding they be made public, an act of cultural defiance against the knowledge hoarding of monasteries. Printers like Aldus Manutius seized the opportunity, cutting special Greek typefaces to mass-produce editions of Homer and Aristotle for newly curious readers. The impact was explosive. Artists like Botticelli painted allegories based on rediscovered myths, while architects like Brunelleschi fused Byzantine dome techniques with classical proportions to reinvent church design. But the real revolution was subtler, a shift in how Europeans saw themselves. Byzantine scholars didn't just bring texts, they brought a living connection to antiquity. Men like John Argyropoulos, teaching Greek at Florence's studio, didn't pass philosophy as dry theology, they performed it, chanting Homeric verses with the cadence of epic poetry. Their pupils, including a young Leonardo da Vinci, absorbed the idea that creativity wasn't just craftsmanship but dialogue with the ancients. The irony was exquisite. As the Ottomans cemented military victory, their conquered subjects delivered the intellectual arsenal that would elevate Europe's artistic and scientific dominance. The Renaissance's glowing masterpieces, Michelangelo's David, Erasmus's satire, Galileo's telescopes, all owed a debt to those fleeing scholars who turned tragedy into the ultimate salvage operation, proving that ideas, unlike empires, never truly fall. The gleaming towers of Granada's Alhambra had barely cooled from their surrender in 1492 when a new kind of holy war began, one fought not with swords but with secret tribunals and the choking smoke of auto-da-fe pyres. Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh from expelling the last Muslim ruler from Iberia, faced an existential question: how to forge a unified Christian kingdom from a land still humming with Arabic prayers, Hebrew scriptures, and underground mosques hidden behind bakery ovens. Their answer: the Spanish Inquisition, a bureaucratic engine of religious purity, so notorious its name still echoes as shorthand for ideological terror centuries later. What began as an instrument of state building quickly morphed into something far darker. Within months of Granada's fall, the monarchs secured a papal bull establishing the Inquisition under their direct control, an unprecedented move that placed spiritual authority squarely in royal hands. Unlike earlier medieval inquisitions targeting Cathars or Waldensians, this was a centralized machine answerable to the crown, led by the fanatical Tomás de Torquemada. His manual of interrogation techniques, the Directorium Inquisitorum, became a chilling playbook for rooting out heresy through psychological warfare. Accused individuals weren't told the charges against them. Informants were rewarded with confiscated property, and confessions extracted under torture were considered valid, so long as the victim repeated them freely later. The primary targets weren't just Jewish and Muslim converts, conversos and Moriscos, but anyone suspected of practicing their old faiths in secret. A woman lighting Friday night candles might betray Jewish roots, while avoiding pork could mark a family as crypto-Muslim. Neighbors turned on neighbors in a paranoid frenzy, knowing denunciations brought financial rewards. The archives of Seville's Inquisition tribunal record cases as absurd as a man accused of heresy for washing his hands before prayer, like a Jew, and as tragic as the poet Louis de Leon, imprisoned for 4 years over a speculative translation of the Song of Solomon. Yet the Inquisition's true power lay in its theatricality. Public trials autos da fe transformed town squares into stages of terror, where penitents wore San Benito humiliation robes and the condemned were paraded before crowds before burning at the stake. These spectacles weren't just punishments, they were propaganda, reinforcing the monarchy's image as defender of the faith while funneling confiscated wealth into royal coffers. When Torquemada died in 1498, his legacy included an estimated 2,000 executions and the forced exile of over 200,000 Jews and Muslims, a demographic hemorrhage that crippled Spain's artisan class and merchant networks for generations. Ironically, the Inquisition's obsession with purity bred its own grotesque contradictions. Forensic archives reveal cases of inquisitors themselves accused of Jewish ancestry, while the notorious Limpieza de Sangre purity of blood statutes created a society obsessed with genealogical scrutiny, one where a single ancestor could taint a family line forever. In Valencia, Muslim irrigation experts were simultaneously persecuted and secretly employed to maintain the very farmlands their expelled kin had once tended. Even the Inquisition's records, meticulously preserved in Madrid's Archivo Histórico Nacional, now serve scholars studying the multicultural world. It tried to erase proof that the tools of oppression can sometimes become keys to rediscovering lost histories. The Inquisition's shadow stretched far beyond Iberia. Its methods influenced colonial regimes in the Americas, where indigenous idolatry was hunted with similar zeal, and its paranoid style resurfaced in 20th century totalitarian states. Yet its most enduring lesson might be this: when unity is enforced through fear, the fractures it leaves behind never truly heal. Modern Spain's debates over mosque construction or Sephardic citizenship reparations are still haunted by those 15th century fires, reminders that the past never really burns away, not completely, not while embers still glow beneath the ashes of memory. Even at its height, the Hansetic League's dominance carried the seeds of its own unraveling. By the 15th century, the political landscape of Europe was shifting beneath the League's feet, as emerging nation-states like England and France began consolidating power under centralized monarchies. These rulers had little patience for semi-independent merchant enclaves operating within their borders, especially ones that paid no taxes and answered to no authority but their own. The Steelyard in London, once a bustling hub of Hanseatic trade, found itself increasingly harassed by English merchants resentful of its special privileges. When Edward IV temporarily revoked the League's trading rights in 1461, it was a clear signal. The age of merchant republics was giving way to the age of kings. New sea routes dealt another crushing blow. Portuguese caravels rounding Africa's Cape of Good Hope in the late 1400s undercut the Hanseatic monopoly on Baltic goods, bringing spices and silks directly from Asia to Western Europe. Why pay Hanseatic middlemen for pepper that had been hauled across a dozen borders when Lisbon's docks overflowed with fresher cargo straight from the source? Meanwhile, Dutch flight ships cheaper to build and crew than Hanseatic cogs began dominating North Sea trade. their holds stuffed with herring and grain bound for markets the League once controlled. Internal fractures widened as member cities pursued self-interest over collective good. Cologne famously broke ranks to make separate deals with English wool merchants, while Lübeck's attempts to strong-arm Denmark into renewing old privileges backfired spectacularly in the Count's War of 1534. The final symbolic blow came in 1669, when the last Hansetic Diet convened in Lübeck, a pathetic gathering of just 9 cities, compared to the nearly 200 that once sent delegates. The League never formally dissolved. It simply faded like a ghost ship into the mists of history. Yet its DNA survives in surprising places. The concept of trade blocs finds early echoes in Hanseatic treaties, while modern maritime law still carries traces of the League's standardized codes. Cities like Hamburg and Bremen proudly display Hanseatic symbols in their coats of arms, and the Hanseatic label now signifies elite merchant tradition rather than geopolitical power. Most ironically, the Baltic trade routes the League so fiercely guarded remain vital arteries of commerce only now. The cargo ships sailing them fly the flags of nation-states that once conspired to destroy them. The League's true legacy wasn't in lasting forever, but in proving that commerce could bind cultures more tightly than crowns ever could. Wat Tyler's blood may have soaked into the dirt at Smithfield, but the ideas that drove the Peasants' Revolt refused to die with him. Though the rebellion collapsed in 1481, its echoes vibrated through English society like cracks spreading through frozen river ice slowly, invisibly but with irresistible force. The revolt's immediate failure was undeniable. King Richard's promises of emancipation melted faster than morning frost, manorial courts reinstated serfdom with renewed vigor, and chroniclers like Thomas Walsingham painted the rebels as devilish rabble to justify their suppression. Yet the ruling class couldn't unsee what had been revealed, that the hands feeding the kingdom might one day rise to strangle it. The next century saw feudalism's foundations quietly erode under economic realities. Labor shortages from recurring plague outbreaks made serfs more valuable alive than bound to fallow fields. Lords who once demanded unpaid work began accepting cash rents instead, not out of benevolence but necessity. By 1400, the once rigid boundaries between serf and free peasant blurred as enterprising workers bargained for wages in silver rather than sweat. Even the language shifted. Court roles began replacing the Old English term theo, serf, with the French-derived vilain, softening the stigma of bondage without yet abolishing it. Legal archives reveal the revolt's subtler victories. When 15th century peasants sued lords for excessive fines, they cited Magna Carta, that same charter the rebels had waived at Mile End. Parliament's 1496 abolition of feudal labor dues didn't mention Tyler by name, but his specter hovered over every debate. Even Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, which redistributed vast church estates to new landlords, accelerated serfdom's demise by breaking ancient manorial ties. The revolt hadn't just demanded change, it had made the status quo untenable. Across the Channel, similar stirrings proved Tyler's uprising was no isolated spark. The 1450 Jacquerie in France saw peasants torch noble chateaux, while Germany's 1525 Peasants' War, fueled by Luther's radical early sermons, briefly threatened to overturn the social order. Though all were crushed, each rebellion forced elites to concede fragments of dignity, lighter tithes, fixed rents, or the right to appeal unjust seizures. These weren't gifts from above, but hard-won concessions to populations now dangerously aware of their collective power. The most enduring legacy, though, wasn't in statutes but stories. Ballads like the Cutty Wren, allegedly coded protest songs from the revolt, were still being sung in 19th-century labor strikes. When the diggers occupied common lands during England's Civil War, they invoked Tyler's cry for communal rights. Even the modern labor movement, with its emphasis on collective bargaining, owes an unacknowledged debt to those 14th century peasants who first grasped that hunger and desperation could be stronger than any castle wall. The revolt's true triumph wasn't in what it achieved, but what it made inevitable proof that even broken rebellions plant seeds no executioner's axe can uproot. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 didn't just end a political spat, it rewrote the medieval rulebook on where earthly power ended and divine authority began. By splitting the act of appointing bishops into two separate ceremonies, secular investiture for land and titles, spiritual consecration for religious office, the agreement created a delicate dance of dual loyalty. Bishops now wore two hats, one as feudal lords answerable to kings, the other as shepherds of souls obedient to Rome. But in this division, the papacy grasped something revolutionary, that by controlling the spiritual half of the equation, they held the ultimate trump card. A king could grant a bishop earthly estates, but only the pope could grant him the keys to heaven. This newfound leverage transformed the church into Europe's shadow government. When emperors like Frederick Barbarossa clashed with popes like Alexander III in the 12th century, excommunication became more than a spiritual threat, it was a geopolitical weapon. A ruler cut off from sacraments risked rebellion from nobles suddenly freed from their oaths of fealty. The papal bull Unum Sanctam in 1302 took this further, with Boniface VIII declaring it absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. Kings might command armies, but popes commanded eternity. The ripple effects reached deep into daily life. Ecclesiastical courts claimed jurisdiction over everything from marriage disputes to usury cases, while tithes funneled peasant harvests directly into church coffers. Even warfare transformed. The concept of just war required papal approval, turning crusades into the ultimate sanctified power plays. Yet the greatest shift was psychological. By framing political resistance as spiritual rebellion, the church made dissent not just treasonous but damnable. A peasant might challenge his lord's taxes, but who would risk their immortal soul? Ironically, this victory sowed seeds for future crises. The very bureaucracy that strengthened papal authority, legates, canon lawyers, tax collectors, bred resentment. When reformist movements like the Franciscans emerged, their calls for poverty and simplicity were thinly veiled critiques of church opulence. The investiture controversy didn't just settle a medieval power struggle, it set the stage for the Reformation's earthquake, proving that no victory, not even God's, stays absolute forever. The flames of Montségur in 1244 didn't just consume the last Cathar perfecti, they lit the fuse for an institution that would cast a shadow over Europe for centuries, the Inquisition. While the Albigensian Crusades' battlefield victories broke the movement's back, its true legacy lay in the bureaucratic machinery designed to hunt heresy long after the swords were sheathed. Dominican friars, nicknamed Dominicanes God's hounds, patrolled Languedoc with quills and parchment, perfecting interrogation techniques that would become the gold standard of religious persecution. Their meticulous records revealed chilling efficiency. Suspects questioned separately to trap them in contradictions, neighbors encouraged to denounce each other with promises of leniency, and confessions extracted under duress later validated as voluntary if repeated without immediate torture. This wasn't just about rooting out heresy, it was about creating a self-sustaining system of control. The Inquisition's genius lay in its paperwork. Detailed manuals like Bernard Gouey's Practica Inquisitionis standardized procedures across regions, turning what had been ad hoc persecution into a repeatable process. Accusations were anonymized to protect informants, creating a climate of paranoia where even minor deviations, refusing to eat pork or washing hands before prayer, could trigger investigations. Penalties ranged from humiliating public penance, wearing yellow crosses for life, to execution, but the real terror was the uncertainty. Trials dragged on for years, keeping entire communities in suspense, their property frozen, their reputations tarnished. The Albigensian model spread like a virus. By the 1300s, inquisitors in Germany turned their sights on the Waldensians, Italy's Franciscan spirituals, and even mystic beguines whose visions threatened church authority. The same tactics once used to dismantle Cathar networks were repurposed to target Jewish conversos in Spain, witches in the Alps, and eventually Protestant reformers. The Inquisition's fingerprint is everywhere. Luther's excommunication trial followed Gui's playbook, and Galileo's heresy charges echoed debates over Cathar dualism. What made this system so enduring wasn't just its cruelty, but its adaptability. Inquisitors became early masters of psychological warfare, offering light penances to lure confessions, then using those confessions to implicate others. They pioneered surveillance techniques, embedding spies in suspect communities, a tactic later adopted by secular secret police. Most insidiously, they framed persecution as salvation. Burning a heretic wasn't murder but an act of charity, rescuing souls from eternal damnation. This moral inversion would echo through history's darkest chapters, from Salem's witch trials to 20th century purges. Yet the Inquisition's archives also preserve unintended resistance. Trial transcripts accidentally captured the voices of medieval women like Napru's Bonter, a mystic who called the papacy the whore of Babylon, and peasants who defiantly told inquisitors, God made the earth for all. These fragments, buried in Latin legalisms, remind us that even the most perfected systems of control can't silence humanity's stubborn hunger for truth. The Albigensian Crusade didn't just eliminate a heresy, it birthed a blueprint for how power, once it claims divine mandate, can turn faith into a weapon that lingers long after the pyres cool. The debate over Tours' significance isn't just about military strategy, it's about the very fabric of European identity. Some historians argue the battle was merely a skirmish in the larger struggle between the Umayyad Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire, with Charles Martel's Franks as peripheral players. Others paint it as the moment Europe's cultural boundaries solidified, a continental divide that shaped everything from religious art to political alliances for centuries. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, but one thing is undeniable: the battle became a legend, and legends have power. Consider the aftermath. While the Umayyads retreated to Iberia, their influence didn't vanish, it seeped into the land that would become Al-Andalus, a beacon of learning where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars collaborated. Yet north of the Pyrenees, a different story unfolded. Martel's victory galvanized the Franks, transforming them from just another barbarian tribe into the self-appointed defenders of Latin Christendom. His grandson Charlemagne would later style himself as the new Constantine, forging an empire that saw itself as the bulwark against Islamic expansion. This wasn't just politics, it was the birth of a mythos, one where Europe defined itself in opposition to the other beyond its southern borders. The battle's cultural echoes are just as revealing. Medieval chroniclers, writing centuries later, inflated Tours into a cosmic showdown, a David and Goliath tale where outnumbered Christians triumphed through divine favor. This narrative seeped into art, literature, and even church liturgy, reinforcing the idea of a Christian West under siege. Fast forward to the Crusades, and you'll find preachers invoking Tours as proof that God favored those who fought for the faith. The irony: while the Umayyads saw the battle as a minor setback in a broader campaign, Europe turned it into a foundational myth, a story told and retold until it became part of the continent's DNA. Yet the most fascinating twist isn't in the past but in how we remember it. Modern scholars question whether Tours truly halted Islamic expansion. After all, Muslim raids into France continued for decades, and the real geopolitical threat to the Umayyads came from internal revolts, not Frankish spears. But history isn't just about what happened, it's about what people believe happened. For medieval Europeans, Tours became shorthand for resilience, a symbol that their faith and way of life could endure against overwhelming odds. What makes Tours so pivotal, then, isn't the clash of soldiers on a muddy field, but the clash of stories that followed. It's a reminder that battles aren't just fought with swords, they're fought with meaning, and sometimes the stories we tell matter just as much as the steel we wield. Dawn on a medieval manor didn't arrive with a rooster's crow. It was measured in strips of tillable land called furlongs and the backbreaking rhythm of the three-field system. Imagine a world where time wasn't tracked by clocks but by the turning of the soil, spring planting in one field, autumn sowing in another, while the third lay fallow to regain its strength. This was the heartbeat of manorialism, feudalism's economic engine, where every acre and hour belonged to someone else. Peasants, whether freeholders, villeins bound to the land, or serfs with no more rights than livestock, awoke to obligations deeper than debt. The lord's demesne, often a third of the manor's best land, demanded their labor first, ploughing his fields, shearing his sheep, mending his mill wheel. Only then could they tend their own strips, scattered like patchwork across the open fields, to ensure no family got all fertile soil. The manor wasn't just a farm, it was a self-contained universe. The blacksmith's forge repaired plowshares with iron from the lord's mines, while the bakehouse used flour ground at his monopoly mill, where peasants paid every 13th sack as a multure tax. Even justice was localized. The Lord's court settled disputes over stray pigs or trampled crops, imposing fines in eggs or days of extra labor. Surviving court rolls reveal the texture of these lives: a woman fined for brewing weak ale, a shepherd whipped for losing sheep, a youth fined layer white for out-of-wedlock pregnancy. The system's cruelty was tempered only by necessity. Lords who demanded too much risked starving their workforce, as evidenced by 13th century revolts like the Stellinger uprising in Saxony, where serfs burned manorial records to erase their debts. Yet manorialism also bred unexpected solidarities. Villagers pooled oxen into teams too expensive for one family, celebrated help ales to support widows, and secretly preserved pre-Christian harvest charms in the guise of saints' days. The common pasture and woodland, the waste beyond the fields, became spaces of small rebellions where peasants foraged firewood or grazed geese despite the Lord's guards. When the Black Death halved Europe's population in the 14th century, these surviving laborers suddenly held bargaining power, demanding wages or fleeing to towns where skills meant freedom. The system didn't collapse overnight, but its fractures spread, like the 1,381 English rebels chanting, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Proof that even the heaviest chains could rust when the ground beneath them shifted. The Children's Crusade didn't just expose the desperation of the young, it held up a mirror to the medieval world's feverish blend of faith and folly. In the summer of 1212, as thousands of children and adolescents abandoned their homes, they weren't just marching toward the Holy Land, they were enacting a radical reinterpretation of Christian sacrifice. Where knights had failed with swords, these barefoot pilgrims believed purity alone could move mountains or part seas. Contemporary chronicles, like those of Alberic of Troisfontaines, describe miracles trailing in their wake, fields of unharvested grain miraculously feeding the marchers, rivers shrinking to let them pass. Whether these tales were divine signs or the embellishments of later writers, they reveal something profound. A culture that saw the extraordinary in the ordinary, where faith could rewrite the laws of nature itself. This wasn't isolated fanaticism. The same year the children marched, grown men in Germany were flocking to dancing manias, whirling in frenzied circles until they collapsed, convinced their ecstasy would bring divine favor. In Chartres, peasants dragged carts of stone for the cathedral's construction, their sweat and blisters offered as penance. The Children's Crusade crystallized a broader medieval impulse, the belief that suffering and innocence could compel God to intervene where diplomacy and warfare had faltered. The movement's leaders, charismatic figures like the shepherd boy Stephen of Cloyes, tapped into a deep well of apocalyptic expectation. Many believed the last days were near, and that the young, untainted by the greed of crusading barons, were the chosen vessels to reclaim Jerusalem. Yet the Crusades' tragic end, whether in shipwrecks, slavery, or quiet dispersal, forced sobering questions. Why would God allow such devotion to end in ruin? Some theologians, like the Cistercian abbot Caesarius of Heisterbach, framed the disaster as a test of faith, arguing that the children's martyrdom purified the Church's collective sin. Others, like the skeptical chronicler Matthew Paris, saw only exploitation, noting how shrewd men of evil intent profited from the young pilgrims' naivety. The Church itself walked a tightrope, unable to condemn the Crusades' piety, yet wary of uncontrolled popular fervor. Pope Innocent III, who had authorized the Fourth Crusade's disastrous sack of Constantinople just years earlier, hesitated to endorse the children's mission, revealing the tension between institutional control and grassroots faith. The Crusades' echoes lingered long after its collapse. Its imagery seeped into medieval art, where wide-eyed innocents were painted alongside martyrs, their purity a counterpoint to the corruption of the age. Folk songs transformed the march into allegory, warning against blind obedience while romanticizing its idealism. Even the movement's failures became a parable, a caution that faith, untempered by wisdom, could lead not to salvation but to shipwrecks both literal and spiritual. What makes the Children's Crusade so haunting isn't its scale or its outcome, but what it reveals about the medieval psyche. In a world where heaven felt tangibly close, where every comet might herald Christ's return, the line between divine calling and collective delusion was perilously thin. The children's doomed march wasn't an aberration, it was the logical extreme of an era that measured devotion in miles walked, hardships endured, and seas that refused to part. Their story endures not because it changed history, but because it lays bare the terrible, beautiful cost of believing too much too soon. 7 men in ermine-trimmed robes holding the fate of an empire. This was the vision enshrined in the Golden Bull's Electoral College, a system so ingenious it still echoes in modern democracies. While the Holy Roman Empire's prince-electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, alongside 4 secular lords like the King of Bohemia, weren't drafting constitutions or campaigning for votes. Their rituals shared surprising DNA with today's electoral systems. Picture this: 14th century Frankfurt bustling with envoys bribing, cajoling, and negotiating behind cathedral doors, while outside, merchants sold souvenir badges to spectators. The election itself was less ballot box, more high-stakes poker game, where votes could be traded for land, titles, or even promises of military support. Yet beneath the horse trading lay a revolutionary idea: power legitimized not by divine right alone, but by collective agreement among elites. Fast forward to modern electoral colleges like the one shaping U.S. presidential races, and you'll spot eerie parallels. Both systems were designed as buffers against pure populism. The Golden Bull to prevent chaotic succession wars, America's founders to temper direct democracies, tyranny of the majority. Each elector's vote carried disproportionate weight. Rhineland archbishops swayed imperial policy, just as Wyoming's 3 electoral votes today hold more per capita influence than California's 54. And just as the Bull's electors met in Frankfurt, America's college gathers state by state, a medieval relic repurposed for a republic, but the contrasts are just as revealing. The Bull's electors were hereditary or ecclesiastical titans, while modern systems, at least in theory, derive authority from the people. And where the Golden Bull's rules calcified into stagnation, the same 7 families dominated for centuries. Functional democracies build in resets, re-elections, term limits, and reforms. Yet perhaps the most telling difference lies in transparency. The Bull's negotiations happened in shadowed cloisters, sealed with wax and whispered oaths. Today, electoral votes are tallied under floodlights and live streams, proof that while the machinery of power evolves, humanity's dance between idealism and pragmatism stays timeless. The Golden Bull's real lesson isn't in its archaic rituals, but in its unintended legacy. the nagging question of who gets to choose the choosers and how much democracy we're willing to trade for stability. When protesters stormed the U.S. Capitol in 2021 shouting about stolen votes, or when EU technocrats debate weighted representation, they're wrestling with the same ghosts that haunted Frankfurt's cathedral: the uneasy marriage of merit and privilege, of voices and vetoes. 7 centuries haven't dulled the tension, they've just given us new parchment to scribble our compromises on. The flames that consumed Jacques de Molay in 1314 didn't just erase a man, they ignited a legend. Centuries after the Templars' brutal suppression, whispers of their survival persist, entwined with tantalizing fragments of truth. Take the mysterious cargo ships that allegedly slipped from La Rochelle's harbor before Philip IV's dragnet closed. Some say bound for Scotland, where Templar symbology later surfaced in Rosslyn Chapel's intricate carvings. Others point to Portugal, where King Denis rebranded the order as the Knights of Christ, conveniently preserving their naval expertise for explorers like Vasco da Gama. These threads aren't pure fantasy, they're patchwork quilts of historical ambiguity stitched with genuine mysteries. Then there's the treasure, or rather, the glaring absence of it. Despite royal agents ransacking every Templar preceptory from Paris to Jerusalem, Philip's coffers saw barely a trickle of the order's famed wealth. This vacuum birthed theories wilder than a medieval bestiary. Had the Templars discovered Solomon's gold beneath Temple Mount? Were they guarding the Holy Grail itself, spiriting it away to remote alpine valleys or even the Americas? The truth was likely more mundane. Their riches were tied up in IOUs from bankrupt monarchs, their treasure existing as lines in ledger books rather than chests of gold. Yet the allure of hidden fortune persists, fueling everything from Dan Brown novels to Oak Island's endless excavations. Rituals proved equally fertile ground for myth-making. The infamous Baphomet idol, described under torture as a bearded head with glowing eyes, morphed in later occult lore into a goat-headed demon, thanks largely to 19th century sensationalists like Eliphas Levi. Modern historians dismiss much of the trial testimony as coerced fabrication, yet the order's secrecy lent itself to projection. Their initiation rites described as spitting on crosses or kissing superiors, infra dorsum, below the back, were likely distorted versions of standard medieval oaths, twisted to suit Philip's narrative. Perhaps the most enduring myth is their phantom survival. From Swiss banking dynasties to Freemasonry's elaborate ceremonies, countless groups have claimed Templar lineage. The irony, these legends often say more about the eras that spawned them than the historical order. Enlightenment Freemasons idealized Templars as proto-republican martyrs, while Nazis bizarrely linked them to Aryan occultism. Even today, conspiracy theorists tie them to everything from the Vatican's shadow finances to the design of the U.S. dollar bill. The truth lies in the gaps between Philip's desperate greed and the Templars' bureaucratic brilliance, between lost records and overactive imaginations. Their real legacy wasn't buried gold or occult secrets, but something far more revolutionary. A blueprint for how power operates when money crosses borders faster than armies. In that sense, the Templars never really died, they just traded their white mantles for suits and spreadsheets. The fields of medieval Europe didn't just starve, they betrayed. After 3 years of relentless rains that drowned crops in their infancy, the weather swung viciously in the opposite direction. By 1320, summer frosts blackened wheat stalks across Flanders, while alpine glaciers began creeping downhill like frozen invaders. This wasn't just bad luck, it was the opening act of the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift that rewrote the rules of survival for centuries to come. Tree rings from ancient oaks and ice cores drilled from Greenland's glaciers tell a chilling story. Between 1300 and 1850, average temperatures dropped by nearly 2 degrees Celsius, enough to shorten growing seasons by critical weeks and turn once fertile valleys into hunger traps. What made this period particularly devastating was its timing. Europe's population had been booming before the Great Famine, pushing settlements higher into marginal lands and clearing forests for farmland. When the climate turned, these vulnerable frontiers collapsed first. Norse settlements in Greenland, established during the warmer medieval warm period, found their pastures freezing solid, their trade routes blocked by encroaching sea ice. Vineyards vanished from southern England, while Icelandic sagas suddenly featured references to months-long sea ice blocking fjords that had been navigable for generations. Even the Baltic Sea froze solid in places during brutal winters, creating surreal scenes of merchants driving sledges between what should have been port cities. The ecological domino effects were profound. Bog bodies from Ireland to Denmark show evidence of mass starvation during this era, brittle bones and stunted growth visible even centuries later. Wolf packs driven by hunger became bold enough to stalk village streets, while desperate humans resorted to eating fern roots and bark bread. Paintings from the period depict ice skating on the frozen Thames and frost fairs, held atop the solid river festive veneers masking the desperation of food shortages beneath. Yet the Little Ice Age's true legacy wasn't just hunger, it was adaptation. Farmers began planting hardier crops like rye instead of temperamental wheat, while new technologies like the moldboard plow turned heavier, wetter soils. The Hansa merchants capitalized on shifting fish stocks, with herring migrating south into their Baltic nets. Even architecture adapted, as steeply pitched roofs appeared across northern Europe to shed unprecedented snow loads. This climatic upheaval holds eerie lessons for our own era. When modern scientists study how medieval societies coped or collapsed, they're looking at more than history. They're observing a stress test for civilization itself. The difference: medieval Europe didn't know why their world was changing. We do, and that knowledge carries its own weight of responsibility. The Great Famine wasn't just a crisis, it was the moment humanity first understood how fragile our dominion over nature truly is. Shakespeare didn't just write a play about Agincourt, he rewrote history itself. When Henry V debuted at the Globe Theatre around 1599, Londoners didn't see a dusty medieval battle. They witnessed a mirror held up to their own era's anxieties. The bard took a muddy, brutal skirmish and spun it into a national myth so potent it still colors how we remember that October day in 1415. His genius wasn't in accuracy. He took wild liberties with facts, but in emotional alchemy, transforming Henry from a calculating medieval monarch into the archetype of the heroic warrior king. Consider the St. Crispin's Day speech, that thunderous call to arms where Henry declares, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." The real Henry likely never uttered those words. Chroniclers mention a brief morale-boosting pep talk, not a poetic masterpiece. Yet Shakespeare's version crystallized something essential about English identity: the underdog spirit, the bond forged in adversity, the idea that shared sacrifice could elevate commoners and nobles alike. This wasn't just theater, it was propaganda for a nation grappling with the Spanish Armada's shadow and Ireland's bloody rebellions. The play's subtext whispered to Elizabethan audiences, "Remember Agincourt." We're still those people. The distortions run deeper. Shakespeare's Henry is a charismatic everyman, sharing jokes with soldiers the night before battle, a stark contrast to the historical king, who ordered prisoners slaughtered mid-battle for tactical pragmatism. The French are caricatured as preening aristocrats, their hubris underscoring divine favor for the humble English. Even the weather gets a rewrite. The play omits the dysentery ravaging Henry's camp, turning a desperate, disease-ridden force into a righteous band of patriots. These weren't oversights, they were calculated choices to forge a usable past. The play's afterlife proves its power. During World War II, Laurence Olivier's 1944 film adaptation became a rallying cry for British resilience, funded by the government to boost morale. Kenneth Branagh's grittier 1989 version, filmed as the Cold War thawed, emphasized the battle's cost, mud-streaked faces, and the weight of command. Both interpretations reveal more about their own times than Agincourt, yet both leaned on Shakespeare's framework. Most fascinating is what the play omits. There's no hint of the longbow's revolutionary role, a curious gap, since Elizabethan England still prided itself on archery. Instead, Shakespeare centers hand-to-hand combat, aligning with Renaissance ideals of martial valor. The real battle's tactical brilliance, terrain mastery, arrow storms is reduced to "God fought for us." This sanitized version endured. Victorian schoolchildren memorized Henry's speeches while learning nothing of the massacre of French prisoners or the campaign's ultimate strategic failure. Shakespeare's greatest trick was making Agincourt feel inevitable. The play's chorus famously calls the theatre a wooden O, begging audiences to piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. 4 centuries later, we're still turning a messy medieval skirmish into a parable of destiny, where every muddy footprint marches toward national myth. The real Agincourt was won by yeomen's arrows and lucky terrain. The Agincourt we remember was won by words. When Pope Urban II's call to arms echoed across Europe in 1095, it didn't just stir hearts, it tapped into a volatile cocktail of human desires that transcended simple piety. For every noble who took the cross seeking salvation, there was a younger son like Bohemond of Taranto, eyeing the chance to carve out a principality where inheritance laws back home had left him landless. The Crusades weren't just a pilgrimage, they were the ultimate medieval startup where spiritual merit and earthly ambition fused into a single venture. Even the poorest peasant who joined Peter the Hermit's ragged, People's Crusade carried dreams as layered as the relics they hoped to touch. Escape from famine, a shot at glory, or just the thrill of walking farther than their village boundary stones. Digging deeper reveals how skillfully the Church framed this earthly opportunism as divine service. Urban's promise of plenary indulgence, a clean slate for sins, didn't just ease guilt, it monetized redemption. Knights drowning in debt from private wars could now swing their swords with heavenly approval, their violence laundered through sacred cause. Chronicler Fulcher of Chartres captured this duality, quoting crusaders who joked they'd follow the army to hell if it meant escaping creditors. The irony, many did exactly that, perishing in the blistering Anatolian wastes or the blood-soaked streets of Jerusalem. Yet to dismiss crusaders as mere treasure hunters misses the potent cultural currents pulling them eastward. Medieval minds lived at the intersection of myth and reality, where relics held tangible power and the apocalypse felt imminent. The rumor that Jerusalem's soil yielded gems when plowed or that the Jordan River ran silver at dawn wasn't just fantasy, it reflected a worldview where the divine and material intertwined. When Godfrey of Bouillon refused a golden crown in the city where Christ wore thorns, he wasn't performing humility, he was navigating a society where symbols carried eternal stakes. The East also promised reinvention. For women like Elena of Aquitaine, who'd later joined the Second Crusade, the journey offered rare autonomy outside domestic confines. For escaped serfs, it meant freedom from feudal bonds, assuming they survived the march. Even failed crusaders returned transformed. The French knight Odo of Duel brought back spices and silks that made his provincial castle the envy of Champagne, while others carried Arabic medical texts that would eventually seed European universities. What made the Crusades unstoppable wasn't pure faith or raw greed, but their alchemy of both, a collective delusion where salvation and conquest wore the same cloak. When the knights stormed Jerusalem in 1099, they didn't just sack a city, they became walking contradictions, equal parts pilgrims and predators, their looting hands clutching rosaries. The true legacy of Clermont lies in revealing how easily idealism and ambition can share a saddle, and how far humanity will ride when they do. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 wasn't just a military conquest, it became a Rorschach test for medieval faiths, with each community etching their own meaning into the bloodstained stones. For Christian chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres, the massacre was divine retribution, a cleansing fire foretold in Revelation. His account revels in the symmetry, Crusaders entering Christ's city on the anniversary of its destruction by Rome a millennium earlier, as if history itself had come full circle. Yet beneath the triumphalism lurked unease. Some clerics quietly noted the contradiction. How could an army supposedly redeeming holy ground commit atrocities that mirrored the very pagan brutality they condemned? Muslim historians like Ibn al-Athir painted a starkly different portrait. His chronicles describe the dome of the rock's floors slick with blood, Quran pages trampled under Frankish boots. Jerusalem's loss wasn't just a political defeat but a cosmic wound, the third holiest site in Islam defiled by warriors who didn't even remove their bloody spurs before praying. The trauma reverberated across the Islamic world, crystallizing into a rallying cry that would later fuel Saladin's reconquest. Yet even here, nuance whispers through. Arab trader accounts found in the Cairo Geniza reveal a surprising detail. Some Jewish families survived by sheltering with Muslim neighbors, their shared vulnerability forging fleeting alliances against the invaders. The Jewish narratives are the most haunting. The Rhineland Chronicles, written by survivors of Crusader pogroms en route to Jerusalem, depict the sack as the latest in an unbroken chain of persecutions. One passage tells of Torah scrolls burned in synagogues where refugees had hidden, the smoke so thick it blotted out the sun, an eerie echo of the temple's destruction in 70 CE. Yet even in despair, glimmers of complexity emerge. A letter discovered in a synagogue attic describes a Frankish knight shielding a rabbi's family, muttering, "Christ preached mercy, not this." What makes these conflicting stories so compelling isn't just their differences, but their shared silences. None mention the Armenian Christians slaughtered alongside Muslims when the Crusaders mistook them for Turks, nor the European pilgrims who later wrote home disgusted by their own army's excesses. The real Jerusalem wasn't a stage for holy heroes or faceless villains. It was a choke point of humanity at its most raw, where faith became both weapon and wound. Centuries later, when peace activists from all three traditions gather at the city's Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Western Wall, they're not just honoring shared history, they're wrestling with memories that refuse to simplify, no matter how fiercely we might wish them to. Consider these 50 events not as isolated moments, but as threads in a vast, shimmering tapestry, each one tugging at the others, reshaping the fabric of an entire millennium. The fall of Rome didn't just vanish an empire, it scattered its seeds from Charlemagne's crowning to the Byzantine scholars who carried classical wisdom into exile. The Mongols' thunderous conquests didn't merely redraw borders, they stitched together trade routes that would later carry the Black Death, the ink of Gutenberg's press, and the whispers of the Renaissance. Even something as intimate as a serf's rebellion or a monk's quill scratching in a scriptorium sent ripples through time, bending the arc of history in ways no one could predict. Yet for all we've unraveled, the medieval world still guards its secrets fiercely. Who truly buried the Templars' treasure, or was their greatest wealth always in the ledgers they left behind? What songs were lost when the Cathars Perfecti walked into the flames at Montségur? And what might Europe have become if the scholars of Toledo had prevailed over the swords of the Reconquista? These aren't just gaps in the record, they're invitations. Because history isn't a closed book, it's a parchment where every faded line holds the potential for rediscovery. So if this journey through castles and plague wards, crusades and cathedrals has stirred something in you, follow it. Track a thread we barely glimpsed, like the Viking sagas whispering of lands beyond Greenland, or the coded margins of a medieval herbal that might hide forgotten cures. The past doesn't just belong to academics in ivory towers, it belongs to anyone willing to listen closely enough to hear the echoes. And who knows, the next great revelation about the Middle Ages might not come from a dusty archive, but from your curiosity, maybe while standing in the shadow of a Gothic spire, or tracing the route of an old pilgrim's path, or simply daring to ask, what if we've been missing the point all along? The medieval world was never just one story. It was 10,000 voices talking across time, and some of them are still waiting to be heard.